A box of elbow macaroni, a can of tomatoes, and a packet of seasoning salt sat on the counter every Friday in 1974, and by 6 o'clock, that was dinner for 5. Nobody called it budget cooking. Nobody called it anything. It was just how your mother fed the family on what was left after the bills. The 1970s were full of meals like that. Suppers built from pantry staples and whatever the grocery store had on sale, stretched with bread or rice, seasoned with whatever was in the cabinet. Your family had a version. So did the family next door, and almost none of them survived into the next century. Number 37 on this list is a one-skillet supper that costs less than a loaf of bread. Wait until you get to number 84, a recipe that vanished the moment its main ingredient left grocery shelves. And number 12 is something your grandmother probably made once a week without ever writing it down. 21. Glorified rice. Cold-cooked rice folded into whipped cream with crushed pineapple, miniature marshmallows, and sometimes maraschino cherries. You chilled it and served it in a glass bowl. The name tells you everything about how people felt about it. Rice that got dressed up and taken out. Lutheran church basements in Minnesota and Wisconsin served it at every funeral, every confirmation dinner, and every Wednesday night supper for decades. The recipe came from Scandinavian immigrants who made a simpler version with just rice and cream. And American cooks added the marshmallows because that is what American cooks do. A cup of leftover rice, a can of pineapple, and you had a side dish that people asked about by name. The side dish was never meant to be the star. That was the whole point. It sat next to the meat and filled the empty space on the plate, and nobody built a meal around it. But the side dish was where the personality showed up. The roast was the roast. Anyone could follow a temperature and a timer. But the side dish was a choice. It said something about where you came from, what your mother taught you, and what you could afford. A woman who brought copper pennies to a church supper was telling you she planned ahead. A woman who made Harvard beets was telling you she still canned her own. The sides were the autobiography of the kitchen, and when they disappeared, we lost more than recipes. We lost the handwriting. Number 20. Skillet tamale pie. Ground beef browned with onion and chili powder, then a can of whole kernel corn, a can of tomato sauce, and a handful of sliced black olives stirred in. You let it simmer until the liquid reduced by half, then spooned cornmeal batter over the top in thick dollops, covered the skillet, and let the steam cook the cornmeal through. When you pulled the lid off, the batter had puffed into golden rounds sitting on top of spiced meat like dumplings on a stew. The bottom was rich and dark with chili. The top was sweet from the corn, and you ate it straight from the skillet with a big spoon. Southwestern families had been making versions of this for generations, but by the early 1970s, it had spread into suburban kitchens across the country through church cookbooks and newspaper recipe columns. A box of Jiffy cornbread mix made it even faster. The whole thing cooked in under 30 minutes, used one pan, and fed a family of 4 with enough left in the skillet for a cold lunch the next day. Chocolate gravy is exactly the kind of dish that makes people from outside Appalachia raise an eyebrow until they taste it. In Kentucky and Tennessee mountain kitchens, it was made with cocoa powder, flour, sugar, and water. No milk, no butter, cooked until thick and glossy, then spooned hot over biscuits as a supper that was both meal and dessert, and neither one exactly. The recipe spread through families in the Cumberland Plateau, from women who knew that sugar and starch could fill a stomach as surely as any meat, and that children who refused beans for the 3rd night running would eat without complaint if something sweet came with it. The wider food world discovered chocolate gravy in the early 2000s and called it Southern, but it was Appalachian first, specific to these mountains. Every family made it slightly differently, some using milk, some adding butter at the end, some keeping no written recipe at all. When your grandmother stopped making it, the version she made stopped existing, and the distance between her version and every other version closed to nothing. Number 25. Franks and beans. You opened a can of pork and beans, sliced 3 or 4 hot dogs into coins, and dumped everything into a cast-iron pot over the fire. Some families stirred in a spoonful of brown sugar or a squeeze of yellow mustard. Others left it plain. It simmered for 15 minutes, and that was the whole meal. You served it with a piece of bread or a handful of crackers, and every kid at the campsite ate it without complaint. It was not a recipe anyone wrote down. It was just something you did with what you had, and the fire gave the beans a smoky sweetness that a kitchen stove never managed. There is something about cooking over fire that changes the way people act. Nobody sat in a camp chair and read a magazine while supper was on in 1975. The fire was the center of the evening. Your father stood over the grate with a pair of tongs and a can of beer. Your mother handed him foil packets and told him which side was up. The kids fed sticks into the flames, and the dog waited under the picnic table for something to drop. Nobody was in a hurry. The meal took as long as it took, and the fire decided when it was done. There was no timer, no temperature dial, no second opinion. You watched the coals, and you learned to trust your hands. That kind of patience does not come from a recipe book. It comes from sitting still long enough to let the heat do the work. Fruit Jell-O with cottage cheese was a nostalgic dessert that combined the sweetness and jiggly texture of flavored gelatin with the creamy, mild tang of cottage cheese. This recipe involved layering or mixing prepared fruit-flavored gelatin with cottage cheese and often included chunks of fresh or canned fruit to add texture and flavor. It was popular in mid-century American households for its bright appearance and ease of preparation. Fruit Jell-O with cottage cheese appealed to families looking for a light, refreshing dessert that required minimal effort and used readily available ingredients. The dish reflected the era's fascination with molded gelatin desserts, which were often served at family gatherings and holiday meals. Its combination of sweet and creamy elements offered a pleasing contrast that made it memorable and comforting. This dessert remains a charming example of vintage American cuisine that continues to evoke fond memories. Pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. Number 19. Impossible cheeseburger pie. Bisquick printed this recipe on the back of the box sometime in the late 1970s, and it became one of the most clipped recipes in the country almost overnight. You browned a pound of ground beef with chopped onion, spread it across the bottom of a greased pie plate, laid sliced tomatoes and shredded cheddar on top, and poured a thin batter of Bisquick eggs and milk over everything. The batter sank to the bottom during baking and formed its own crust. That was the trick that made people clip it out and tape it to the inside of a cabinet door. No rolling pin, no pie dough, no pastry skill of any kind. You poured liquid into a dish and the oven did the rest. The pie baked for about 25 minutes and came out golden brown on top with a soft, custardy crust underneath that held together just well enough to slice into wedges. You could add whatever was sitting in the vegetable drawer: green peppers, canned mushrooms, a handful of frozen broccoli left over from Sunday. But the original called for nothing beyond beef, cheese, tomato, and the Bisquick batter, and most families never saw a reason to change it. On a summer evening when the idea of standing in a hot kitchen felt like punishment, this pie gave you 10 minutes of prep and then 25 minutes of doing absolutely nothing while the oven worked. It came out looking like you had spent an hour. Kids ate it without a word of protest, and the leftovers were just as good cold the next day, straight from the refrigerator. Bisquick eventually rotated the recipe off the box, and the families who never saw it there never learned it existed. The best homemade meal, in my opinion, was lasagna. Nowadays, people enjoy this dish on laid-back Saturday afternoons. And to be honest, I agree. Leave it in the oven for an hour, and a cheesy-filled indulgence is born. These components include the basic kitchen must-haves: layers of lasagna sheets, pasta sauce, and some cheese, of course. It has met those expectations of the history books as well. Did you know that its origins are implanted in the backstories of ancient Greece? Yes, you heard me right. This was not an original Italian cuisine. Nevertheless, many dispute that the first record of such a recipe being written down dates back to Naples during the Middle Ages. But wherever it started, it's now seen as a go-to dish in any household, no matter the country. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and ground meat was a budget-friendly recipe that made the most of limited meat supplies by pairing them with inexpensive fillers. This dish took hollowed-out bell peppers and filled them with a mixture of cooked rice, small amounts of ground meat, onions, and seasonings to create a hearty and colorful meal. The rice acted as a filler, absorbing flavors and stretching the meat to feed more people. Peppers were often chosen for their availability and mild flavor, which complemented the savory filling without overpowering it. The stuffed peppers were baked until tender, sometimes topped with a light sprinkle of cheese or tomato sauce for extra richness if available. This recipe appeared often in mid-century cookbooks as an example of practical cooking that balanced nutrition, taste, and cost. It was a way to make meat go further without sacrificing flavor or appearance. The dish brought color and variety to the table, making mealtime more appealing during an era when fresh produce was seasonal and meat was rationed. Stuffed bell peppers embodied the ingenuity of cooks adapting to economic constraints with simple, satisfying solutions. So fish chowder is something that's always really been around. That's no news to you. You have grown up in coastal cities. Plus, you don't even have to be around places like those. Got a pond, river, literally any body of water, and a dad with a fishing hobby. You know what I'm talking about. Apparently, this wasn't a fact missed by the government either. A big part of their surplus and food drive efforts was fish. An even bigger part of what you could do with these fish was fish chowder. It was a great way to use the meat because it actually took a lot less fish than other recipes did. Think about it. You might think grilling or steaming your fish is economical, but you're talking about one fish per person? Nobody's got that kind of pantry. At least, they definitely didn't in the World War. Fish chowder required things that were already very much being adopted into daily use by the populace. I'm talking mostly about crops that were widely available, like potatoes and onions. You only needed milk and water after that to make it work. It was a great way to get everything your body needed at an affordable price. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Potato pancakes, known to some as latkes, were a golden ticket in lean times. Potatoes were cheap, easy to grow, and endlessly versatile. Grate them up, mix with a little flour and egg, and drop them in a sizzling pan. What you got was crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and filling all the way through. They were perfect for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. You could top them with applesauce, sour cream, or eat them plain. They did not ask for much, and in return, they gave a lot. This dish crossed borders, generations, and social classes. It belonged to Jewish households, yes, but also to farming families and struggling workers. Everyone found comfort in them. Everyone found flavor. And when money was low, a pile of latkes on the table felt like a feast. Today, we might chase after fusion dishes and modern tweaks, but there is something to be said for the kind of meal that just works. Potato pancakes were that meal. Always have been. Maybe always will be. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too.
Number 15, cold collared sandwiches packed leftover greens between bread for lunches that provided vitamins and fiber. Families cooked large batches of collards with smoked meat then saved portions for next day's meals. The greens were squeezed to remove excess liquid, seasoned with hot sauce or vinegar, and spread between bread slices. The flavor was earthy and slightly bitter, the pot liquor having concentrated overnight. Workers carried these knowing the greens provided nutrition that bread alone could never offer. Children ate them without complaint because collards were familiar. The taste of Sunday dinner transformed into Monday lunch. The sandwiches traveled well because greens stayed flavorful cold. This lunch represented practical genius of stretching one meal into two, ensuring that labor of cooking collards fed families multiple times.
Sugar sandwiches were born from empty cupboards and the will to make something sweet out of nothing. All it took was plain white bread, a swipe of margarine, and a light dusting of sugar. Simple ingredients that somehow tasted like kindness. You could hear the crunch of the sugar crystals between your teeth, feel the soft pull of the bread, and smell the faint scent of butter that made the whole house feel warmer. For children, it was a treat. For adults, it was survival with a smile. When times were hard, a loaf of bread stretched across days, feeding imagination as much as hunger. Mothers made sugar sandwiches to quiet rumbling bellies, and fathers took them to work wrapped in wax paper. It was a dessert that cost next to nothing but delivered comfort in abundance. Sometimes the bread was toasted, sometimes it wasn't. Every house had its way. No one thought of it as poor man's food then. It was simply life, sweetened where it could be. Today, the thought of it might seem strange, but for many, it was the taste of love when love was all there was left to give.
Number 9, red beans and rice. Monday was wash day in New Orleans, and a pot of red beans could mind itself while the women scrubbed clothes all morning. The tradition was built around Sunday's leftovers. Whatever ham bone or pork bone was left from the Sunday meal went straight into the pot Monday morning, along with a bag of small red beans, an onion, celery, and bell pepper. Then it simmered low for hours, asking for nothing more than an occasional stir while the heavy work of laundry got done. By supper time, the beans had cooked down soft and creamy, the broth gone thick and savory from the bone, and it all got ladled over a bed of white rice. The dish was filling, it was cheap, and it stretched a single bone across a whole pot big enough for everyone. Generations of working families leaned on it precisely because it fed many for the price of few. Creamy beans, smoky pork, and rice that drank up every drop. A Monday institution born from making do.
Number 26, stuffed celery. You took a rib of celery and filled the groove with cream cheese mixed with whatever you had. Pimento and chopped olives were the classic. Some women used peanut butter or a sharp cheese spread from a jar, or cream cheese with crushed pineapple. You cut each rib into pieces and lined them up on a plate like little boats. They showed up on every relish tray and holiday appetizer spread from about 1955 through 1985, and then they simply stopped. The crunch of cold celery against the soft filling was the whole appeal. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. A whole tray cost less than $1. Kids ate them because the cream cheese was mild, and adults ate them because they needed something to do with their hands before dinner was ready. Number 23, skillet Salisbury steak. Ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, minced onion, and a dash of Worcestershire, shaped into oval patties and browned hard on both sides in the skillet. You pulled the patties out, stirred a tablespoon of flour into the drippings, poured in beef broth and a splash of ketchup, and scraped up every brown bit stuck to the bottom. The patties went back into that gravy, the lid went on, and the whole thing simmered until the sauce turned dark and thick and the meat was tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. A can of sliced mushrooms went in during the last 5 minutes if you had one. TV dinner companies sold a frozen version of this in foil trays with a compartment of mashed potatoes. But the skillet version had 3 times the meat and gravy that actually tasted like something. Families who made this never called it Salisbury steak. They called it hamburger steaks, and it showed up on the table whenever ground beef was on sale, and the house needed a meal that felt bigger than what it cost. Bulldog gravy was what you made when there was no meat at all, also called white gravy or milk gravy or just gravy with no qualifier. It started with whatever fat you had, a heaping spoon of flour stirred in until the roux thickened, and then milk or water poured in slow. In Appalachia, the version made with water instead of milk was sometimes called poor gravy, even by the people who ate it, because they knew the difference and they felt it. You poured it over day-old cornbread that had gone dry, and the gravy brought it back to something that could fill a stomach. In Kentucky and West Virginia, mining communities during the Depression, and again during the coal slowdowns of the 1950s and 60s, this was what supper looked like on the worst weeks of the month. Not a figure of speech, just the actual food on the actual table. The children who ate it grew up and moved to cities and never made it again, and some never told their own kids it had existed. Number 30. Hobo dinner. You tore off a sheet of aluminum foil, dropped a fistful of ground beef in the center, and piled on sliced potatoes, onions, and carrots. Salt, pepper, a pat of butter if you had it. You folded the edges tight, set the whole packet on the coals, and walked away. 20 minutes later, the meat had browned, the potatoes were soft, and the butter had turned everything golden. Every Boy Scout troop in America knew this meal. Every church camp served it on the first night. Your mother made it in the backyard when she did not feel like scrubbing pots. The foil did all the work. You ate straight from the packet with a fork, and when you were done, you crumpled the foil and tossed it in the fire. No plate, no mess, no recipe to lose. Clam dip in the 1970s was a cocktail party essential, the kind of appetizer that seemed to draw guests like a magnet. Made from minced clams blended into cream cheese or sour cream, it was seasoned with lemon juice, Worcestershire sauce, and a hint of garlic. Served chilled with an array of crackers, chips, or crudités, it provided a rich, briny contrast to the other finger foods on offer. It was a dish that managed to be both sophisticated and accessible, appealing to seafood lovers and the simply curious alike. Many hosts appreciated how quickly it could be assembled, often just minutes before guests arrived. In the 1970s, when entertaining at home was often a regular weekend event, having a reliable, crowd-pleasing dip in the repertoire was invaluable. Clam dip's creamy base and subtle seafood flavor made it stand out without overpowering other flavors on the table. Paired with a crisp white wine or a classic cocktail, it set the tone for a relaxed yet polished gathering. For many, it is still a taste that instantly recalls the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses from decades past. Peanut soup was a filling option that came straight out of the need for protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Ground peanuts simmered with water or milk created a creamy, nutty broth that was surprisingly hearty. Onions, celery, or a bit of leftover potato might be added to give it body, but the peanuts did most of the heavy lifting. The flavor was rich enough that it almost felt indulgent, even though it cost very little to prepare. Served with cornbread or biscuits if available, it could stretch into a complete meal for an entire family. Many households in the South relied on peanuts as a cheap crop, and this soup was a natural way to put them to use. For many children who grew up during the Depression, peanut soup became a nostalgic memory of warmth and survival, showing how simple ingredients could stand in for things they could not afford. 26. Ham salad sandwiches. You took the leftover ham from Sunday dinner, ran it through a hand-crank meat grinder bolted to the kitchen counter, and mixed the results with mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, and a touch of yellow mustard. You spread it thick on soft white bread and wrapped it in wax paper for a packed lunch, or set it on the supper table with a bag of potato chips on a hot night when nobody wanted to cook. The meat grinder was doing all the work, turning a piece of ham that would have dried out in the refrigerator into something brand new. The grinder vanished first, replaced by a food processor nobody used for ham salad. Then the sandwiches followed it out the door. Summer supper in the 1970s was not an event. Nobody mapped out the week on Sunday afternoon. You opened the refrigerator, looked at what was there, and figured it out. The meal followed the weather and the budget, not a recipe from a magazine or a delivery app. If the thermometer hit 92, you did not turn on the oven. If there was a cucumber and some leftover meatloaf and half a jar of pickles, that was dinner. The beautiful thing was that nobody apologized for it. Setting a plate of cold cuts and sliced tomatoes on the table was not considered lazy. It was considered smart. Somewhere between then and now, we decided that every weeknight supper had to look like a cooking show. We lost something real in that trade. Bulk cooking has increased in popularity, trending that Mom did know what she was talking about. Therefore, my next choice for affordability must be casseroles. And I mean, who does not love a good casserole? The variations of casseroles seem to span back to times we cannot even imagine. As it happens, casserole is a French word that means saucepan. It is one of the oldest methods of communal eating, dating back to 1708. On second thought, be honest. Throwing all that you can into one pot, steaming it for a couple of hours, and serving a hot and delicious meal that serves many can be anyone's first choice when it comes to budget friendliness. Who else agrees? Please don't tell me that my subconscious sentimental mind is the only one. Baked bean and sausage casserole was a slow-cooked, hearty dish combining canned beans with small pieces of sausage to create a flavorful and affordable meal. Beans, often navy or kidney varieties, were a pantry staple thanks to their low cost, long shelf life, and high protein content. Adding sausage pieces, sometimes leftover or inexpensive links, brought a smoky richness that enhanced the beans without requiring large amounts of meat. The casserole was assembled in a baking dish, sometimes with onions or seasonings layered in, then baked slowly to let the flavors meld. This recipe was beloved for its simplicity and versatility. It could feed a family with minimal ingredients and effort. It was common in community cookbooks aimed at budget-conscious home cooks during the mid-1900s, especially during times of rationing or economic difficulty. Baked bean and sausage casserole was often served with bread or a simple salad, making it a complete and filling meal. The dish exemplified the era's focus on making affordable ingredients taste satisfying and comforting at the family table. Hominy grits were a really classic staple from the South, particularly from Appalachian cuisine. They're a lot closer to the kind of vegetable-based eating you've seen so far. They're just a little different in execution. See, potatoes weren't the only top dog around, and they definitely weren't number one either. That's a spot you can comfortably reserve in every debate for corn. It was widely grown in America, especially in the South, and hominy grits were made from dried corn, which was extremely available. It doesn't take a scientist to put two and two together here. This recipe spread like wildfire through a country that was juggling the after effects of the Depression and the ongoing effects of a world war. It's mostly typical of the common folk to fit the bill so that countries can even have their wars, and that's the case here too. Also, there were a few more trends in American culture besides just growing crops in the backyard. People really started to take notes out of their neighbors' lifestyles. They began to see what different kinds of cultures, cuisines, and recipes existed around them, mostly because a lot of these, like Appalachian cuisine, were much better at what Americans were trying to do. That is, make the best you can out of the littlest amounts of groceries possible and keep it organic. Mock apple pie was America's most delicious trick, and it worked. Picture this: no apples, no orchard, no harvest. Just Ritz crackers stacked in place of fruit, baked into a pie that fooled even the most skeptical dinner guest. This was culinary camouflage at its finest. During World War II and the Depression, fresh produce was a luxury many could not afford, yet dessert still had a place at the table, so creative cooks decided to imitate what they could not buy. They crumbled crackers, poured over lemony syrup, and sprinkled cinnamon until the illusion was complete. And somehow, it tasted like apples. Children did not know the difference. Husbands were shocked, and mothers, with a smile tucked behind their quiet pride, pulled another miracle from the oven. Mock apple pie did not pretend to be gourmet. It pretended to be enough, and it was. It tasted like resilience, sweetened with survival. So the next time you think you need more, remember the pie that needed almost nothing. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too.
Number 20, crackling bread was breakfast that used every bit of the hog, including the crispy bits left after rendering lard. Cracklings, those crunchy pieces of fried pork skin and fat, were folded into cornbread batter before baking. The result was cornbread studded with pockets of salty, chewy richness that made plain bread into something special. Children searched for the crackling pieces in their slices, savoring each bite of crispy pork among the cornmeal. This bread required nothing extra on top because the fat was already baked inside. Families who raised their own hogs had cracklings available after butchering, and nothing was ever wasted. The bread came from the oven fragrant and golden. This was poverty food that tasted like abundance, turning scraps into something worth anticipating. Crackling bread carried heritage in every bite.
Pot liquor with crumbled cornbread was the Southern secret of survival. After greens were cooked down, the broth left behind, rich with flavor from fatback, onions, and spice, became its own meal. Families poured it over cornbread, breaking the crust into the savory liquid until it turned thick and satisfying. Nothing was wasted, not even what others might call scraps. That broth held all the vitamins, the flavor, and the history of every meal made with care. It was soul food in its purest form, humble, hearty, and deeply nourishing. People joked that pot liquor could cure a cold, but really, it cured weariness. It carried the taste of the land, the garden, and the hands that made it grow. Elders said the steam rising from a bowl could warm a heart as much as it filled a stomach. The greens might change, collards, turnips, or mustard, but the tradition stayed the same. Pot liquor was the reminder that nothing good should ever be lost. Not flavor, not effort, not love. A bowl of it tasted like resilience itself. Today the term still lingers, but few remember the feeling that came with it. A quiet pride in knowing nothing went to waste.
Number 20, smoked ham, hock, and beans. This was the dish that could stretch one smoked hock across a whole week of dinners. The ham hock was the joint above the pig's foot, a knuckle of skin, fat, and a little dark meat clinging to the bone, and it was sold for next to nothing. But country cooks knew how to make a little meat go a long way. A single smoked hock dropped into a pot of dried butter beans or pinto beans would flavor the entire pot, its smoke and salt seeping into every bean over hours of low simmering. Monday, it was beans and rice. Tuesday, the same pot, reheated and thicker. By midweek, the cook would pull the meat off the bone and shred it back in, and the bone itself kept giving flavor until it was bare. One cheap joint, a bag of dried beans, and a heavy pot turned into supper night after night. A whole week of dinners from a single bone.
Number 29, copper pennies. These were carrots sliced into thin coins, cooked until just tender and marinated overnight in a sauce of tomato soup, sugar, vinegar, oil, mustard, and Worcestershire. You served them cold straight from the jar. The sweet vinegar bite made them taste nothing like regular carrots, and that was the whole point. Women made jars of copper pennies at the start of the week and kept them in the refrigerator for days. They got better the longer they sat. Every potluck table in the Midwest had a dish of them next to the deviled eggs, and nobody under 40 has any idea what you are talking about if you mention the name now. The recipe fit on an index card, and the jar cost almost nothing to fill. Before I go any further, for the folks who want more recipes like these gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now back to the list. Number 21, pork chop supper. 2 bone-in pork chops, a sliced onion, a sliced potato, and a can of cream of celery soup. You seared the chops until they had color, laid the onion and potato slices around them, poured the soup over everything, and covered the skillet. 30 minutes on a low flame and the potatoes were tender. The chops were falling off the bone, and the soup had turned into a thick gravy that coated everything in the pan. The bone-in chops were the cheapest cut at the butcher counter, and the cream of celery soup was the secret weapon that turned a plain piece of pork into something your husband asked about the next morning. No side dish needed, no salad bowl to wash. The potato was already in there, and the gravy held the whole plate together. There is something worth saying about the skillet itself. In the 1970s, most families owned one good pan, not a set, not a matching collection hanging from a rack above a marble island. One heavy skillet, usually cast iron, sometimes handed down from a mother or an aunt, seasoned with decades of bacon grease and seared onions. That skillet was not a piece of cookware. It was infrastructure. It held breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It went from stovetop to oven and back without complaint. And when a woman stood at her stove at 5:30 with 4 children circling the kitchen and a husband pulling into the driveway, she did not reach for a recipe. She reached for that skillet, because whatever went into it came out as supper. The first frost came fast in the mountains and killed whatever was still green overnight. Fried green tomatoes were what you made the week before. Every tomato that hadn't ripened, sliced thick, dredged through cornmeal with salt and pepper, and laid into a skillet of hot bacon grease until the outside went golden and crackled and the inside softened just enough to give. They weren't the romanticized version that arrived in restaurants decades later. They were a practical harvest, a way of eating what would otherwise rot on the vine. The cornmeal crust transformed the chalky bitterness of an unripe tomato into something with texture and heat, and enough fat to feel like a meal. Mountain families in North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee had done this since the 19th century, using cornmeal ground at the nearest mill. You never added anything fancy to the dredge. The grease had to be hot enough that the slice sizzled the second it touched the pan. If it didn't, you'd waited too long. If you had to ask how hot the grease was, you weren't ready to cook them. Number 29, campfire chili. 1 pot, 1 spoon, 1 ring of stones. You browned ground beef in a cast iron pot over the flames, dumped in 2 cans of kidney beans, a can of tomatoes, and enough chili powder to make your eyes water. It simmered while the sun dropped behind the tree line. Some families added diced onions. Some threw in a green pepper they had been saving since the drive up. Nobody measured a thing. You ladled it into tin cups because the bowls were still buried in the trunk, and the first sip burned your tongue every single time. It was the meal you made the first night at camp, before you had sorted the cooler or found the water pump. It filled you up and cost next to nothing. Before I go further, for the folks who want more old recipes like these collected in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a cookbook full of meals like the ones in this video. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not mention it again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Eggplant Parmesan casserole brought a touch of Italian-inspired comfort to the frugal dinner table, making use of the abundant and inexpensive eggplant that was widely available in grocery stores and gardens. Slices of eggplant were dredged in breadcrumbs, sometimes homemade from stale bread, and baked or pan-fried until tender. These slices were layered in a casserole dish with marinara sauce and cheese, then baked until bubbly and golden on top. The eggplant's mild, creamy texture absorbed the flavors of the sauce, giving the dish richness without the need for costly meat. For those watching their spending, this casserole was a way to create a hearty, crowd-worthy meal that felt indulgent yet cost very little. Leftovers reheated beautifully, making it perfect for meal planning. Some home cooks added extra vegetables like spinach or zucchini between the layers, stretching the recipe even further. Paired with a side of pasta or crusty bread, eggplant parmesan casserole was both filling and satisfying, offering all the comfort of a traditional Italian dinner at a fraction of the price. It stood as proof that vegetables could take center stage in a main dish without sacrificing flavor, heartiness, or the joy of gathering around the table. Fruit corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Number 27. Porcupine meatballs. The name came from the way uncooked rice poked out of the meatballs after they simmered in tomato sauce. You mixed ground beef with raw rice, an egg, chopped onion, and whatever seasoning was in the cabinet. You rolled them into balls the size of a walnut and dropped them into a pot of Campbell's tomato soup thinned with a can of water. They cooked on low for about 45 minutes while the rice swelled inside the meat and pushed through the surface like tiny quills. Even on a warm evening, the smell pulled everyone into the kitchen. Kids ate them without complaint because they looked funny and tasted good. By the time microwave meals showed up in the 1980s, porcupine meatballs had already vanished from most kitchens. Number 20. This brings me back to one important aspect: the value of family. On the other hand, without going on a nostalgic tangent, let's delve into yummy baked potatoes, this time with a twist. Note that this version I am about to discuss has now transformed itself into a popular fast food item. Despite that, it is easy to do at home. All you need is a well-done baked potato, then stuffed with some yummy treats that are budget-friendly as well, and if you are feeling adventurous, a splash or two of sour cream. Perfect. Anyhow, this may seem like a new spin-off to many families, but researchers have discovered that native South American cultures have been using it as a staple for thousands of years. Although their techniques are questionable at best for modern society, as they usually include things like a banana stuffed with rice. Vegetable loaf, also known as meatless meatloaf, was a creative way to enjoy a comforting classic without using expensive meat. This loaf combined grated or finely chopped vegetables such as carrots, zucchini, and onions with grains like rice or breadcrumbs to bind the mixture. Eggs or milk were added to hold it all together before baking the mixture into a firm, sliceable loaf. Seasonings and herbs were used to enhance flavor, making the dish tasty enough to stand on its own or to accompany a simple sauce or gravy. Vegetable loaf was a popular recipe in old Betty Crocker cookbooks because it offered an affordable, nutritious alternative during times when meat was scarce or costly. It was often served as a main dish with potatoes or steamed greens, providing both comfort and sustenance. This recipe reflected mid-century home cooks' ingenuity in creating meatless meals that felt satisfying and wholesome without straining the household budget. We're just getting started on the menu of a typical middle-class household during these times, though. Next on the list, we have Spam and potato casserole. Normally, your reaction to that would be a suspiciously raised eyebrow and an elaborate, "Huh?" But in times like these, it was a blessing to smell from the hallway. See, even with the whole rationing thing, there were preferences and levels to it. Fresh meat always took priority over things like Spam because they wanted to avoid cases of sickness on the front lines. That meant that while there was a big hit in the stocks of fresh meat all over the country, you couldn't say the same about Spam. Sure, it definitely wasn't as available as it used to be, but it wasn't half as scarce as everything else either. Spam was even spread and given out to people in need through Lend-Lease programs and became a pretty dependable source of protein in the United States. It was easy to preserve too, much more than fresh meat, which usually required cooling of some kind. Spam? You just had to make sure the can was on a shelf. Spam could also work with bread slices or casseroles, so that made it really easy to mix into a person's everyday regular diet. Tomato gravy over rice was not fancy, but it was love ladled into a bowl. Southern homes in particular knew how to stretch tomatoes into something filling, something warm, something that made a half-empty pantry seem like a feast. With a can of tomatoes, a spoonful of flour, and a dash of fat, usually bacon grease or lard, you had the beginnings of something remarkable. It simmered on the stovetop until the house smelled like Sunday. Then it was poured over rice, a cheap grain that filled bellies without complaint. This dish was not about impressing guests. It was about feeding 5 children with the same amount of food meant for one. Children, decades later, remember that aroma with the kind of fondness usually reserved for holidays. Tomato gravy over rice was a working-class triumph, a war-era comfort, and a Depression-era staple. It did not try to be anything else, and that is what made it unforgettable. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier.
Number 17, black-eyed peas and rice. In the South, this was not just New Year's Day luck. This was Wednesday, Thursday, and whatever day came after. Dry black-eyed peas simmered with a ham hock and onion, salt, and pepper until the peas turned creamy and the broth went thick. Served over rice, it became the most complete meal a poor black family could afford. A 1-pound bag cost 15 cents in the 1940s and fed your family for 2 days. The ham hock, often reused across 3 or 4 pots, cost a dime. In the Gullah Geechee communities along the Carolina coast, this dish was called Hoppin' John, and its roots traced back to West African rice and bean dishes carried across the Atlantic by enslaved people. The rice was not incidental. West Africans were specifically enslaved to work Carolina rice plantations because they already knew how to cultivate it. They fed their enslavers with their own knowledge, then fed themselves with the cheapest version of the same grain. That was the cruelty and the genius in one pot.
Bread pudding with raisin ends was a dessert born from frugality and love. Stale bread was never thrown out. It was soaked in milk, sweetened with sugar, and baked until golden. A handful of saved raisins, often from the bottom of the jar, made it special. The pudding puffed in the oven, filling the house with a buttery warmth that made everyone smile. For many families, it was the only sweet thing they could afford, yet it felt like a feast. Some drizzled syrup over the top, others sprinkled nutmeg if they had it. Every bite told a story of making do and making joy out of scraps. It was the dessert of Saturday nights and Sunday suppers, of families who refused to let the week's hardships dull their joy. Mothers measured nothing. They just knew by sight and smell when the pudding was right. The crust at the top turned caramel brown, while the inside stayed soft, creamy, and full of comfort. Even after plates were cleared, the scent lingered, proof that sweetness didn't need wealth, only care. Bread pudding wasn't just dessert. It was testimony to the creativity of those who refused to let hard times steal their sweetness.
Number 22, smothered potatoes and onions. If there were potatoes in the bin and an onion on the counter, supper was already settled. Smothering was one of the great techniques of the Southern kitchen, a slow braise that turned plain ingredients into something soft and savory. The cook sliced potatoes and onions thin, laid them in a heavy skillet with a spoon of bacon grease, and let them cook down low and slow with the lid on. The steam trapped under that lid did the work, melting the onions into the potatoes until the whole thing went tender and sweet. Toward the end, the lid came off so the bottom layer could brown and form that prized golden crust against the iron. A little salt, a little black pepper, and maybe a splash of water to keep it from sticking was all it took. Served with a piece of cornbread, it made a full plate without a scrap of meat. Pure comfort built from two of the cheapest things in the house.
Number 30, Watergate salad. Nobody knows exactly why they called it Watergate, but every church basement in 1975 had a bowl of it. You mixed a box of pistachio pudding into a tub of Cool Whip, folded in canned crushed pineapple and a handful of miniature marshmallows, and put it in the refrigerator until it set. Some people threw in chopped pecans. The color was a pale green that did not exist anywhere in nature, and kids either loved it or refused to touch it. It was not a salad by any honest definition, but that is what everybody called it. You brought it to potlucks, barbecues, and holiday dinners, and the bowl always came home empty. Pistachio pudding mix still costs about $2, but nobody thinks to make it anymore. Number 24, salmon patties. A can of pink salmon, drained and picked clean of bones, mashed in a bowl with a beaten egg, a handful of crushed saltine crackers, diced onion, and a pinch of black pepper. You shaped the mixture into flat rounds the size of your palm, pressed firm so they held together, and laid them into a skillet with hot oil. They fried golden on each side in about 3 minutes, and when you flipped them, the kitchen filled with a smell that sat somewhere between a fish fry and a Sunday breakfast. Some families served them plain with ketchup. Others made a white sauce with butter, flour, and milk and poured it over the top. The can cost almost nothing, and one can made 4 patties, enough for 2 people with a side of canned peas and buttered bread. Coastal families and landlocked families alike kept canned salmon on the shelf for the same reason. It never spoiled, it never disappointed, and it turned into dinner in under 15 minutes without a single trip to the store. Before I go further, for the folks who want more recipes like these all in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a collection of the best old recipes I have covered on this channel and more. You can find it on my website vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not push it again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Fatback had no glamour. It was the part of the hog nobody else wanted. Pure white fat salted and stored in a crock. But in Appalachian kitchens from the 1930s through the 1960s, it was the engine of every meal. You sliced it thin, laid it in a cold skillet, and let it render slow. By the time the slices went brown and rigid at the edges, the pan was full of clear golden fat worth more than the meat itself. The crackling slices got eaten, salty, crunchy, intensely porky, but the drippings went into a jar by the stove that was never empty if the family was doing all right. A half-pound of fatback cost a few cents at the company store in coal towns across West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, and it seasoned every pot of beans, every skillet of greens, every pan of cornbread for a month. You didn't measure. You poured until the color looked right, and if you had to ask what that meant, you hadn't spent enough time watching. The jar by the stove was the first thing to disappear when the next generation moved to town. Number 19, foil-baked lake trout. This was the meal that turned a fishing trip into a feast. You caught a trout, gutted it by the water, rinsed it clean, and laid it on a sheet of aluminum foil. Inside the cavity, you stuffed a few slices of lemon, a pat of butter, and whatever fresh herbs you could find growing near the campsite. Wild dill if you were lucky. A few sprigs of something green that smelled right. You sealed the foil tight, set the packet on the coals, and waited 15 minutes. When you opened it, the flesh was white and flaky and soaked in its own juice, and the lemon had perfumed the whole thing so deeply that you could smell it from the picnic table 10 feet away. This was not a meal you planned. It was a meal that happened because someone caught something. The fish was free. The foil was already in the supply box. The only cost was the patience to sit on a log with a rod and wait. Entire families ate from one large trout if the catch was good, and the leftover bones went back to the lake. Back then, at plenty of state park campgrounds, you could walk down to the water with a rod and a coffee can full of worms, and nobody asked to see a license. If the fish were biting, you ate well that night. If they were not, you opened a can of beans. That was the system, and nobody questioned it. Ground beef and potato hash was a skillet meal that stretched a small amount of meat into something hearty enough to satisfy hungry stomachs after a long day. Diced potatoes were fried until golden and crisp, then combined with browned ground beef, onions, and simple seasonings. The result was a dish with plenty of texture, crispy edges on the potatoes, tender bits of beef, and the sweetness of caramelized onions tying it all together. This meal was endlessly adaptable, with some families adding vegetables like bell peppers or corn for extra flavor and bulk. It was a natural choice for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and it could be made in large batches without much extra effort. In frugal kitchens, hash was a way to make every ingredient count, turning basic staples into something satisfying and filling. It was also quick to prepare, making it a weeknight favorite. Served on its own or topped with a fried egg, ground beef and potato hash was the kind of no-frills comfort food that felt like a reward at the end of the day. It proved that even the simplest combinations could be deeply flavorful and endlessly comforting. Cabbage roll. Casserole was one of those Depression-era meals that made the most of scraps while still delivering real comfort to the table. Instead of carefully rolling leaves around bits of rice or meat, families would simply layer chopped cabbage with leftover grains, stale bread, and whatever scraps of vegetables they had. Sometimes there was even a small amount of ground pork or beef mixed in, though most of the time the casserole relied on stretching every flavor from the scraps themselves. A little vinegar or tomato juice added tang and moisture, while onions gave it a base of flavor. Once it baked, the entire dish came together into something hearty enough to serve a large family for very little money. The casserole was a dish that spoke to both ingenuity and the realities of the time, because not everyone could spare hours or meat for proper cabbage rolls. Layering scraps turned survival cooking into something close to celebration. Number 20. Deviled ham on white bread. The little red can with the devil on the label was an Underwood product that lived in nearly every pantry in the decade. You peeled back the lid, spread the paste on soft white bread, and ate it cold. That was lunch. That was sometimes supper on a July evening when the kitchen was too hot to even think about cooking. Salty, meaty, slightly spicy, and it lasted forever on the shelf. Mothers packed these for road trips and pool days and afternoons when the kids came in from the yard, too hungry to wait for anything else. Underwood still makes deviled ham today. The cans sit on grocery shelves untouched, and nobody is coming back for them. Before central air conditioning became standard in American homes, cooking supper in July was a physical test. The kitchen was the hottest room in the house because it had the stove and no cross breeze. A woman standing over boiling water at 5 in the afternoon in a 1973 ranch house in Memphis was working in temperatures that would shut down a modern office building. So the meals got simpler. They got faster. They moved toward the counter and away from the oven. Cold suppers, skillet meals, sandwiches built from the canned goods shelf. This was not laziness. This was survival engineering. Every meal on this list solved the same basic problem. How do you feed a family when the kitchen itself is trying to cook you first? First on the list is my dad's ultimate favorite meal, delicious spaghetti and meatballs, without needing a fancy description. All that was needed was some ground beef, breadcrumbs, a couple of eggs, tomato sauce, vinegar, a dash of brown sugar, and the most important element, obviously, spaghetti. By the way, pasta was considered a staple in my household, and should be once again, as the world is your oyster when it comes to its endless possibilities. Undoubtedly, a true Italian delicacy, but many culinary experts would disagree since this dish has origins dating back to ancient Persia. Other nations include Sweden, China, and Greece. Nonetheless, it seems to still be favored by many, globally. Cornmeal casserole was a staple in many American homes, especially when budgets were tight and stretching ingredients mattered most. This simple baked dish combined basic pantry staples like cornmeal, eggs, and milk to create a hearty side, or even a main dish that could feed a family without breaking the bank. The recipe was straightforward enough for beginner cooks and required no fancy equipment or ingredients. Cornmeal gave the casserole a slightly grainy texture and a comforting golden color, while the eggs acted as a binder to hold everything together during baking. Milk added richness and moisture, ensuring the casserole was never dry or bland. Families could easily adjust the seasoning to taste, sometimes adding a pinch of salt, pepper, or a dash of sugar depending on what was on hand. This casserole often appeared in community cookbooks and government pamphlets encouraging economical meal planning during lean times. It was versatile too, sometimes served plain alongside soup or stews, and other times topped with leftover vegetables or bits of cheese when available. For many, cornmeal casserole was more than just food. It was a symbol of resourcefulness and comfort, a way to make modest ingredients feel like a feast on the table. Wartime meatloaf was pretty much how everyone dealt with all the stress that came about thanks to the economy. Sadly, though, that's really just the tip of this depressing iceberg. Things were starting to get a lot worse thanks to the Second World War. Before people knew it, food rationing and poverty were just a part of your weekly routine and lifestyle. Households really had to get into the habit of preserving things for as long as they could. That's on top of how they were already rationing things down to the last grain of rice and sugar. Meatloaf in general became popular exactly thanks to sentience like that. It was during the Second World War, after all, that meat started to become prioritized for rationing. Why, you might ask? Well, those troops need to get their protein from somewhere if they are going to fight a war. Plus, it could be stacked and used in tandem with some pretty cheap stuff. Some breadcrumbs, crackers, and cornmeal meant you could have a pretty loaded and filling meatloaf. Who wants to bite that gift horse in the mouth? Also, there was the fact that you could do so much with meatloaf. All of this made it an ideal choice for the kind of climate people found themselves in during World War II. Water pie sounds like a mistake, but it was a miracle in disguise. Imagine staring at an empty pantry, knowing your children needed something sweet to make the night feel a little more normal. That is when resourcefulness turned water, sugar, flour, and a bit of butter into a warm pie that filled the kitchen with comfort. It had no eggs, no milk, and no fruit, but it had hope. Women during the Great Depression baked these pies when everything else was gone. The crust was thin and humble, the filling set like a soft custard, a sugary illusion crafted from almost nothing. Some versions included a touch of vanilla or cinnamon if luck struck, but the real ingredient was imagination. You see, water pie was never about luxury. It was about creating a little sweetness when the world felt bitter. Water pie was not just dessert, it was dignity, sliced and served. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it, a perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed.
Number 22, neck bones and rice. Neck bones were the cut that nobody wanted. Butchers in black neighborhoods sold them for 10 to 15 cents a pound in the 1950s because there was almost no meat on them. But your grandmother with a heavy pot and 4 hours of patience could turn 2 pounds of neck bones into a meal that fed 6 people. Brown them first, add water, onion, garlic, salt, and pepper, and let the pot simmer until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned thick and dark with collagen. Served over white rice, It made your grandmother's kitchen smell like love and necessity in equal measure. Families who migrated to Chicago and Detroit brought this recipe north and cooked it in apartments where the only Southern thing left was the cast iron and the knowledge of what to do with a cheap cut of bone. The meat was almost nothing. The broth was everything.
Sorghum-drizzled sweet potatoes were nature's candy for people who couldn't afford much else. Roasted or baked until tender, the potatoes were sliced and topped with golden sorghum syrup, thick, fragrant, and slightly bitter. That first sticky bite balanced sweetness and earthiness in perfect rhythm. It was a poor man's dessert that didn't feel poor at all. Families made it after Sunday dinner or during harvest season when potatoes were plenty. The syrup came from cane mills, often pressed by hand and sold in jars at the market. Sorghum wasn't sugar's rival. It was its soulful cousin, born of patience and labor. Sweet potatoes, meanwhile, were a gift of the land, lasting through winter and warming every meal. Together, they turned thrift into treat. Even today, the smell of roasting potatoes and warm syrup feels like coming home to a time when gratitude was the sweetest spice.
Number 13, smothered turkey wings. A pound of fresh turkey wings cost 19 cents at the meat counter in 1957. Most white shoppers passed the wings by because they didn't know what to do with them. Your grandmother knew exactly what to do. She washed the wings in cold water, dredged them in flour, seasoned with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and a pinch of poultry seasoning, and browned them in a skillet of bacon grease until the skin was crisp like paper. Then the wings went into a deep pot with 2 yellow onions, 3 stalks of celery, and 4 cups of water. The lid went on. The pot simmered on the back burner for 2.5 hours. By supper time, the meat was falling off the bone and the broth had turned into a thick mahogany gravy. She served the wings over rice with the gravy ladled across both. 6 children licked their fingers clean. You'd watch the wing bones get picked over twice.
Number 19, perfection salad. This was a gelatin mold made with lemon jello, vinegar, shredded cabbage, diced celery, chopped pimiento, and sometimes grated carrot. You dissolved the jello in boiling water, added vinegar and salt, let it cool until it thickened, then folded in the vegetables and poured it into a ring mold. It chilled overnight and came out looking like a jewel. The name was not a joke. It came from a recipe contest held by the Knox Gelatine Company in 1905. A home cook named Mrs. John E. Cook from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, entered the dish and won 3rd prize. Fanny Farmer, already famous for her Boston Cooking School cookbook, sat on the judging panel, but she did not create the recipe. Knox printed it in their promotional pamphlets, and from there it spread across the country. By the 1920s, it had become the standard for modern organized cooking. The set held everything in place. No wilting, no dripping, no mess on the tablecloth. By the 1970s, perfection salad had spread to every region of the country. Women's magazines printed variations, but the original lemon and cabbage version remained the standard. It sat on the holiday table, unmolded onto a plate of lettuce leaves, sometimes with a dollop of mayonnaise on top. The whole thing cost less than 50 cents and fed 10 people. When gelatin salads fell out of fashion in the 1990s, perfection salad went with them. But unlike the sweet Jell-O molds that deserved to go, this one had real vegetables and a genuine tang that balanced a heavy meat dinner. It was practical, beautiful, and honest. It required patience, but no skill beyond following a recipe. And it looked like you had spent the whole morning in the kitchen. The name still fits. Number 17, beef and macaroni skillet. Ground beef browned with a chopped onion and a clove of garlic, then a can of tomato sauce and a cup of water poured straight in. You dumped a handful of dry elbow macaroni right into the pan, put the lid on, and dropped the heat. 20 minutes later, the noodles were soft and red and heavy with beef drippings. No colander, no second pot, no boiling water on the stove. The pasta cooked in the meat sauce and came out tasting like it had simmered for hours. Every grocery store in America sold elbow macaroni for pennies, And when the boxed dinner kits arrived on those same shelves a few years later, this dish quietly disappeared from weeknight tables. Not because anyone forgot how to make it, because reaching for a box was easier than remembering. Red-eye gravy required exactly two things: country ham and black coffee, the stronger the better. You fried the ham, pulled it out, poured a cup of dark coffee over the hot drippings, and scraped the browned bits loose as it hissed. 3 minutes. Done. Some people in Appalachia called it red sop, and the name came from the reddish ring the coffee and fat left at the skillet's edge, darker on the outside, lighter in the center, like an eye. Country ham had been a staple in Virginia and the Mountain South since colonial times, and the tradition of deglazing ham drippings with coffee likely came from Scots-Irish settlers who wasted nothing and never saw a reason to change. You poured it over grits or biscuits, and the bitterness of the coffee cut the salt and fat in a way that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. But the quick suppers didn't end with ham. Beneath all that smoky pork lay a whole world of mountain resourcefulness, where garden scraps and foraged food and vegetables nobody else wanted carried as much weight as any cut of meat. Number 28. Tin can stew. You saved a large coffee can from home, scrubbed it out, and turned it into a cooking pot. Cubed potatoes, chunks of whatever meat was left from the night before, a sliced carrot, and enough water to cover everything. You set the can on a flat rock beside the fire and let it bubble until the potatoes gave way under a fork. Families who camped on tight budgets did not bring Dutch ovens or matching cookware. They brought empty cans and a pocket knife. The can warped and blackened after a couple of uses. Nobody cared. You grabbed another one and started again. The stew was plain, the pot was free, and nobody at the campsite looked twice. Tuna salad stuffed tomatoes were a colorful and nutritious 10-minute recipe featuring halved tomatoes filled with a quick tuna salad mixture, perfect for lunches or light dinners. The tuna salad was typically made by combining canned tuna with mayonnaise, chopped celery, onions, and seasonings, then spooned into hollowed tomato halves for a visually appealing presentation. This dish offered a refreshing balance of creamy, tangy tuna salad with the juicy, slightly acidic tomato, making it a satisfying yet light meal option. Popular in 1960s America, tuna salad stuffed tomatoes embodied the trend of combining convenience foods with fresh produce for speedy preparation. Served chilled, they were often enjoyed at picnics, buffets, or simple home meals. While less common today, this recipe remains a charming example of mid-century quick dishes that balance taste, nutrition, and ease. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, a slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Number 21. Summer sausage and cracker plate. You sliced a log of Hickory Farm summer sausage into thin rounds, laid them out next to a sleeve of Ritz crackers and a few slices of Colby cheese, and called it supper. Maybe some pickles from a jar. Maybe not. Hickory Farm sold gift boxes around Christmas, but the sausage itself sat in grocery stores year-round, and families leaned on it hard during hot weather when nobody wanted to stand near a stove. Cold, salty, satisfying, and ready in 3 minutes flat. The idea of calling sliced meat and crackers a real supper sounds almost radical now, but in 1975 it was just a normal Thursday. Next, we have shepherd's pie, also known as cottage pie, a meal that has always lived up to its potential. Whichever way you know this dish, it was one of the many staple meals in my childhood, as leftovers were assured. So, you might be wondering what is needed to complete such a savory pie. Well, I'm about to astonish you, as you only need mashed potatoes, butter, garlic, or herbs, minced meat, and cheese. First off, I would like to point out that there is nothing wrong with taking shortcuts in cooking, referring to the fact that nowadays, pre-packaged cottage pie cook-in sauce is readily available. So go ahead and skip on time if that is your heart's content and dish up a wholesome meal. Furthermore, historical facts are rather compelling, as they date back to the 18th century when this new dish was mainly served in a vast amount of regions throughout Ireland and the United Kingdom. Creamed mushrooms on toast was a popular snack or light meal that combined mushrooms cooked in a creamy white sauce served over toasted bread. This dish was a favorite in budget cooking because it used inexpensive ingredients that were easy to find or preserve. Mushrooms added an earthy flavor and meaty texture, which paired well with the smooth, rich sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. The toasted bread provided a crunchy contrast and a filling base to soak up the creamy topping. This recipe was commonly found in old Betty Crocker cookbooks, where it was praised for its simplicity and satisfying taste. It could be prepared quickly, making it a convenient option for busy families or those with limited cooking skills. Creamed mushrooms on toast was often served as a snack, a light lunch, or a meatless dinner, showing its versatility in the mid-century kitchen. It was also a clever way to stretch ingredients and add variety to the weekly meal plan without extra cost. Anyway, remember how I mentioned backyard gardens? Well, one of the best things to make from those was vegetable cobbler. Before I bite your ear off about that, you might be a little interested in the whole backyard garden concept. What do I mean when I say that? Well, the proper term for them would be victory gardens. They were small plots that were used by families to cultivate and nurture fruit and vegetables during the many food shortages. These shortages were also pretty frequent, so this entire culture of gardening pretty much became the backbone of most families. That was its primary purpose, and its secondary one was giving a household more leverage. See, if you had a garden, especially a particularly bountiful one, that also meant you had potatoes and other typical crops, and that meant that you had a lot more bartering power than your less blessed neighbor. People would trade things all the time as money had lost its value, and there were many people looking to trade a hand-me-down for the ingredients to a killer vegetable cobbler. Plus, the fresher the ingredients, the better the cobbler, and it only ever used basic vegetables too. Cabbage soup was the quiet soldier of family kitchens. Always there, always enough. When the meat ran out and the money dried up, a single head of cabbage could stretch itself into days of nourishment. Chopped into ribbons and simmered down with whatever else was in the pantry, onions, carrots, potatoes, it became more than just soup. It was a warm hand on a cold day, a pot that never seemed to empty when you needed it most. Sometimes you added tomatoes, other times a soup bone if you were lucky. But most times it was just cabbage, salt, and the kind of patience only the hungry understand. Families did not eat it because they loved cabbage. They ate it because it kept them full, and because every generation before had done the same. Immigrant families in particular knew its power, bringing cabbage soup across oceans and into American kitchens where it met new hardships but kept the same purpose. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America.
Number 14, streak-o-lean and beans. Streak-o-lean was a cut of salt-cured pork belly with thin ribbons of meat running through the fat, cheaper even than bacon. You sliced it thin, fried it until crisp, and served it alongside a pot of pinto beans that had been simmering all day. In the 1930s, streak-o-lean sold for 8 cents a pound. Dried pinto beans cost a nickel, For 13 cents, a mother could feed a family of 6 a hot supper that stuck with you until morning. Her children did not know it was a poverty meal. They thought it was just what Monday tasted like. When your family talks about the meals they miss, they are not missing the ingredients. They are missing the person who made 13 cents feel like enough. Here is what the sharecropping system did to Black families that you need to understand. It did not just limit what you could eat, it controlled what you could grow. Plantation owners required sharecroppers to plant cotton and nothing else. If you planted a garden, you risked losing your tenancy. If you raised chickens without permission, the landowner could take them. The system was designed to make your family dependent on the commissary store, where prices were double what they charged in town, and every purchase was added to a debt that never shrank. That is why these meals are so narrow. Not because Black families lack creativity, because the system restricted your options to the space between what was allowed and what was needed.
Cornbread and buttermilk was supper disguised as simplicity. A bowl of crumbled, day-old cornbread soaked in cold buttermilk was how many ended their day, cheap, filling, and quietly satisfying. It wasn't a meal for company, but for peace. You'd sit on the porch, spoon in hand, watching the sky dim, each bite mixing tang with warmth. The sour milk softened the crumbs, turning yesterday's bread into something soft and familiar. It was cooling on hot nights, easy to digest, and full of quiet joy. For elders, it tasted like childhood. For children, it tasted like home. Some added honey or salt, others left it plain. Every house had its own way. It was food for when there wasn't much left in the pantry, yet it filled more than stomachs. Cornbread and buttermilk fed the soul too, reminding weary hearts that comfort didn't come from plenty, but from gratitude.
Number 15, smothered chicken. A single tough old hen too tired to lay became a Sunday-worthy supper through the patience of smothering. This was not the crisp fried bird of the holidays. It was the everyday way to cook a cheap, stringy chicken until it surrendered. The cook browned the pieces in a heavy skillet, then deglazed the pan with a little broth or water, scraping up the dark browned bits that held all the flavor. Seasoning went in, the lid went on, and the whole thing simmered low until the meat pulled away from the bone and the liquid thickened into a deep brown gravy. A sliced onion melted into the sauce, sweetening it. By the end, one small bird had become a pot of tender meat swimming in gravy, enough to spoon over a mountain of rice and feed a full table. Served over rice or potatoes, it turned the toughest hen into comfort. Slow cooking made the cheapest chicken taste like a feast.
Number 24, broccoli cheese casserole. Chopped broccoli mixed with a can of cream of mushroom soup, shredded cheddar, and a sleeve of crushed Ritz crackers on top. You baked it at 350 until the crackers turned golden and the cheese bubbled through the cracks. Some cooks added a beaten egg to hold it together. Others stirred in cheese whiz instead of real cheddar because it melted smoother. This was the dish that convinced a generation of children that broccoli was worth eating. It showed up at Thanksgiving, Christmas, and any potluck where someone needed a hot side. The Ritz cracker topping was the part everyone fought over. The whole thing cost the price of a can of soup and a head of broccoli, and it fed 8 without complaint. Number 19, chicken cacciatore. This dish started in the Italian countryside, where hunters brought home whatever bird they could find and braised it in tomatoes, onions, garlic, and whatever herbs grew outside the door. By the time it crossed the Atlantic and landed in American kitchens, it had become something else entirely. A housewife in Pittsburgh or Providence did not need a hunter or a countryside. She needed a package of chicken thighs, a can of whole tomatoes, a green pepper, an onion, and her skillet. You browned the chicken pieces in olive oil until the skin crisped, set them aside, softened the onion and pepper in the same fat, added the crushed tomatoes with a bay leaf and dried oregano, and nestled the chicken back in. Then you covered it and let the whole thing simmer for 40 minutes. The chicken fell apart in the sauce. The tomatoes thickened into something that tasted like it had been cooking since morning. The juice pooled at the bottom of the skillet, and you soaked it up with a piece of bread torn straight from the loaf. This was not a quick dinner. It was the Sunday meal that turned a kitchen into a different country. The aroma reached every room in the house, and neighbors passing on the sidewalk knew exactly what was cooking. Italian families in Brooklyn, in South Philadelphia, in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, all made their own version, and none of them wrote it down because the recipe lived in the hands, not on paper. By the late 1970s, jars of pre-made marinara started appearing on grocery store shelves, and within a decade, most people stopped making cacciatore from scratch. The jar was faster, but it never tasted like the skillet version because the skillet version had the chicken drippings in the sauce, and no jar on earth can replicate what happens when raw garlic hits hot olive oil in cast iron. Nobody called them hoe cakes because they were fashionable. They got the name because early Appalachian settlers sometimes cooked them on the flat of a hoe blade held over an open fire when no skillet was available, a technique documented in the Foxfire series of oral histories from the 1970s. By the time these kitchens were at their peak, hoe cakes were made in cast iron with no ceremony. Cornmeal, a pinch of salt, enough water for a pourable batter, dropped onto a hot greased skillet in silver dollar rounds and cooked until the edges went lacy. They were done in under 10 minutes. No oven, no yeast, no waiting. You could make them while the beans simmered and have bread on the table before the pot was ready. Some cooks added an egg. Most didn't. They used what they had, which was cornmeal and bacon grease in a hot pan. Younger generations grew up thinking cornbread always came from a box and always baked in the oven. So the knowledge of making bread on a stovetop with nothing but cornmeal and heat slipped away quietly, without anyone choosing to let it go. Number 22, campfire hash. This was the morning after meal. You diced whatever potatoes were left from last night, chopped an onion, and threw it all into a greased skillet over the coals. If there was leftover meat, that went in too. Corned beef from a can worked. So did bits of hamburger or diced Spam. You pressed the whole mess flat with a spatula, let the bottom get crispy, and flipped it once. Salt, pepper, maybe a fried egg on top if someone had thought to bring eggs. Hash was the campfire equivalent of cleaning out the refrigerator, except there was no refrigerator. Just a cooler with yesterday's leftovers and a skillet that could hold all of them. Hummingbird cake was a sweet southern treasure that swept across the nation in the 1970s, known for its tropical flavors and moist crumb. Made with ripe bananas, crushed pineapple, and chopped pecans, the batter was warmly spiced, usually with cinnamon, and baked into tall, tender layers. Cream cheese icing covered each layer generously, adding tang to balance the sweetness. It was a cake for weddings, church gatherings, and family celebrations, standing out from the usual chocolate or vanilla. Rooted in Southern hospitality, it was often baked in large portions to share generously. Each slice offered a perfect mix of fruit, nuts, and rich frosting, creating a dessert that felt both indulgent and comforting. Even now, it evokes memories of gatherings where generous slices were served on floral plates alongside coffee or sweet tea, marking moments that were meant to be remembered. Stewed apples with bread cubes was a dessert that stretched every bit of fruit to its fullest during the Depression. A few apples, sometimes bruised or close to spoiling, were peeled and stewed with sugar or molasses if available. To make the dish go further, stale bread cubes were added to soak up the syrupy juices. The result was a warm, comforting pudding-like dish that could serve several people with only a handful of apples. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might be added when they could be spared, but even without them, the dish was sweet and filling. For many children, this was the closest thing to pie they would taste during those years. It turned waste into dessert and brought comfort at the end of long days. Even though it cost next to nothing, it felt like a treat worth remembering. Stewed apples with bread cubes showed how creativity kept hope alive. Number 29, tomato aspic. This one sounds wrong to modern ears, but in the 1970s, a molded tomato gelatin was a perfectly normal thing to set on a supper table in July. You dissolved a packet of Knox gelatin in hot tomato juice, added a splash of Worcestershire and a squeeze of lemon, and poured it into a ring mold to chill. It came out looking like something from a magazine cover. You filled the center with cottage cheese or chicken salad and called it a meal. The whole thing kept the stove off and the kitchen cool, and by the 1980s, nobody under 30 would touch it. Today, it is gone entirely. Before I go on with the rest of this list, for those of you who want more recipes like these, all gathered together in one place, I have put together the Vintage Recipe Guide over at my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not mention it again in this video. If you want it, it is there. Now, lots of people around the globe would debate about the true origin of this next meal, which was always one of many meals my mom, especially my grandmother, used to make. Nonetheless, let's dive headfirst into this delicious meal pantry-friendly chicken a la king. Weirdly enough, as a child, this meal seemed so fancy, yet it could be enjoyed anytime. All you would need are milk, flour, salt and pepper, green bell peppers, mushrooms, and chicken over a heaped spoon of rice. Coming back to the aforementioned origins of this dish, well, it is a widespread belief that it was first served to patrons of New York's Brighton Beach Hotel way back in the 1980s by its inventor, per se, E. Clark King II. Whichever way the cookie crumbles around its history, it's one of those meal options that, by the turn of the century, took flight worldwide. Cabbage and noodles skillet was a quick and economical meal that combined sautéed cabbage with egg noodles for a simple yet satisfying dish. Cabbage was often abundant and inexpensive, making it a reliable vegetable during times when other produce might be costly or scarce. Egg noodles added texture and carbohydrates, turning the dish into a filling meal suitable for lunch or dinner. The cabbage was typically cooked with onions and a bit of fat or butter to bring out its natural sweetness and mellow bitterness. Seasonings were kept simple, focusing on salt and pepper or a dash of vinegar to brighten flavors. This recipe was common in old Betty Crocker cookbooks and regional American kitchens, especially those influenced by Eastern European traditions. The dish showcased how humble ingredients could be transformed into a nourishing meal that stretched budgets without sacrificing taste or satisfaction. Mock scalloped potatoes were a really creative dish. I just talked about how potatoes were one of the easiest crops to grow around, and I wasn't making them look good either. It really is true that potatoes were the silver lining to many an American's awful Tuesday afternoons, especially in times like that, where it was so hard to get anything that resembled comfort food. Scalloped potatoes, on top of being pretty easy to prepare, were made using substitutes for milk, cream, cheese, and butter, and that's a part of what mock culture was. It was this entire trend of people recreating popular dishes, even traditional ones, with substitute ingredients. Mock apple pies, mock casseroles, and meatloaves. There was barely an area of American cuisine that it hadn't hit. Potatoes were also one of the frontliners when this entire movement was going on, and mock scalloped potatoes used fillers to imitate that creamy texture. It was a really good way to get carbs in your diet, which is something everybody needed. If there's one thing people ran even lower on than their food during the 30s and 20s, it was their energy. So you might recall another thing I mentioned if you've been paying attention. You have, haven't you? It'd really kill me if you weren't. Just kidding, I know you are. Bread pudding is what happens when love meets leftovers. You took stale bread, dry, forgotten, no longer welcome on its own, and turned it into dessert, into something warm, soft, and sweet. That is magic. And for so many families, it was also necessity. Milk, eggs, sugar, maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon. That was all it took to create a dish that felt like home. Nothing wasted, everything transformed. Bread pudding came from both frugality and affection. It was served after Sunday dinners and made in haste on rainy weeknights. Children loved it because it tasted like cake. Parents loved it because it cost next to nothing. It proved a simple truth. What you have is often enough if you treat it with care. Bread pudding taught that better than any lecture ever could. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter.
Number 23, fatback and grits. If you grew up in a sharecropper's household in Georgia or South Carolina in the 1940s, your morning started the same way every day: a slice of fatback fried in a cast iron skillet until the edges curled and the grease pooled. Then a bowl of grits cooked in water with that rendered fat stirred through. Fatback cost almost nothing because white families did not want it. Butchers sold it for pennies a pound, and the salt preserved it for months. For black children, this was breakfast every single day. Not sometimes, every day. The fat kept you full through hours of walking miles to the segregated school that had no cafeteria. Nutritionists would later call this diet deficient. The families who survived on it called it Tuesday.
Fried apple hand pies were the dessert of working hands. Made from bruised or leftover apples that couldn't sell, they were chopped, sweetened with sugar water, and wrapped in scraps of dough. Fried until golden, they smelled like comfort itself. Cinnamon, fruit, and hot oil blending in the air. These little turnovers fit right into lunch pails and children's hands alike. The crust crackled as you bit into it, revealing warm, spiced fruit inside. They didn't need ovens, only a skillet and a little oil, the tools every kitchen already had. People fried them before Sunday service or packed them for road trips that never went far. It wasn't about waste, it was about making sweetness from what was left. In towns where money was short, a fried apple pie could turn an ordinary day into a small celebration. They disappeared quickly, but their memory lingered. Proof that even in scarcity, love found a way to taste like plenty.
Number 25, neck bones and rice. This was the dish that proved a family could eat well on the scraps the butcher almost threw away. Pork neck bones were the bones left after the good cuts were sold off, sold cheap because there was barely a bite of meat clinging to them. But black Southern cooks knew the secret was the long simmer. They covered those bones in water, dropped in an onion and a little garlic, and let the pot go for 2 or 3 hours until the meat fell off and the broth turned dark and rich. Then they cooked the rice right in that stock, so every grain soaked up the flavor of the bone. What looked like nothing on the cutting board became a steaming bowl that filled a grown man up after a day in the field. The trick was patience, not money, tender meat, savory rice, and a broth worth keeping. A whole supper out of what others called waste.
Number 22, pickled beets and eggs. You dropped peeled hard-boiled eggs into a jar of pickled beet juice and let them sit for at least 2 days. The eggs turned deep magenta all the way to the yolk, and the flavor was sweet, tangy, and faintly earthy. Pennsylvania Dutch families kept a jar going all winter. Diners in the mid-Atlantic states served them on the counter in big glass jars. The color hooked you or scared you off. Children either loved the purple surprise when you cut the egg open or refused to believe it was still an egg. They lasted for weeks and tasted better the longer they sat. 1 jar of beet juice could pickle a dozen eggs, and a dozen eggs cost almost nothing. Number 22. Eggs poached in tomato sauce. A can of whole tomatoes crushed by hand in the skillet with a diced onion, garlic, salt, pepper, and a pinch of red pepper flakes. You let the sauce simmer until it thickened, then cracked eggs right into the bubbling tomatoes and covered the pan. 5 minutes later, the whites had set and the yolks were still runny. You scooped each egg out with a spoon, dragging the thick tomato sauce with it, and laid it over a piece of toast or a slice of crusty bread. Italian grandmothers in neighborhoods across the Northeast called this eggs in purgatory. Nobody else called it anything. They just made it when the refrigerator was nearly empty and the only things left were eggs and a can of tomatoes. The yolk broke over the bread and mixed with the sauce, and that combination fed more families on more desperate nights than most people will ever know. Fried cabbage cost almost nothing. A full head fed a family of 5, and the only other ingredient was salt pork, which was the cheapest cut at the smokehouse or the company store. You shredded the cabbage coarse, got the skillet hot, laid the salt pork in until it colored, then added the cabbage all at once and covered the pan long enough for steam to wilt it. Then you took the lid off and let the water cook out until the edges browned at the bottom of the pan. The pinch of sugar was the secret. Not enough to taste sweet, just enough to pull the natural sugars out of the cabbage and help it caramelize, and the women who knew this never needed to say it out loud because they had learned it by watching. In Depression-era Appalachia, cabbage was one of the few vegetables that grew cheap and reliable in Rocky Mountain soil, and fried cabbage with side meat appeared on supper tables across West Virginia and Virginia coal country 3 and 4 nights a week without anyone considering it hardship. It tasted like something made with care. It was. Number 23. Foil-wrapped corn on the cob. You peeled back the husk, rubbed the ear with butter and salt, wrapped it tight in aluminum foil, and set it directly on the coals. 15 minutes later, you pulled it out with tongs and peeled back the foil, and the kernels were blistered and sweet and faintly charred in a way that boiling water never produced. Some people left the husk on and soaked the whole ear in the lake first. Either way, you burned your fingers trying to eat it before it cooled. Corn was cheap in July and August. You could buy a dozen ears at a roadside stand for spare change. Every campsite in the Midwest smelled like it. Cheese and pickle toasties offered a warm, tangy snack that was a common fixture in vintage American cookbooks. These toasties combined melted cheese with pickles, sandwiched between slices of bread and grilled or toasted until golden and bubbly. The contrasting flavors of creamy cheese and sharp pickles created a satisfying balance that made this snack appealing across age groups. Quick to assemble and easy to cook, cheese and pickle toasties became a favorite when a simple yet flavorful snack was needed without fuss. The recipe's enduring popularity stemmed from its use of accessible ingredients and the way it elevated basic staples into a tasty treat. These toasties often brought a sense of nostalgia, reminding many of afternoons spent at home or school with comforting homemade snacks. They exemplify how mid-century cooks combined familiar flavors in straightforward ways to deliver maximum enjoyment with minimal effort. The warm, crispy exterior and gooey filling remain a hallmark of this beloved classic. Rolled oat meatloaf was another way people made do when meat was a rare luxury during the Depression era. The idea was simple. Oats were cheap, filling, and easy to find, so they became the backbone of many loaves when ground beef was scarce. Housewives would combine rolled oats with onion, a little broth or tomato juice, and perhaps an egg if one could be spared, then bake it until firm. The oats took on the flavor of the few seasonings and drippings that were used, giving the illusion of meat even if very little was present. If there was any beef or pork to add, it stretched further thanks to the bulk of the oats. Served with gravy made from pan drippings or even a thin tomato sauce, it could feel hearty enough to pass for the real thing. Many families came to appreciate the flavor and comfort it provided, even without meat. Back to the list. Number 28. Barbecued bologna steaks. You asked the deli counter for a thick slice of bologna, about ½ an inch, scored it with a knife so it would not curl, brushed it with bottled barbecue sauce, and threw it on a hot grill or into a skillet. It sizzled and browned and smelled like a cookout, even though it cost almost nothing. You served it on a hamburger bun with mustard and pickles. In small towns from the Ozarks to the Ohio Valley, this was a summer standby. Kids loved it. Dads loved it. Nobody pretended it was health food. It was a 10-minute supper with the screen door open and the radio playing in the next room. When it comes to budget, nothing screams out more than that of chicken and dumplings. The meal can be regarded as boring, but it's a great-tasting delicacy, especially during those cold winter months. Besides it being a great tummy filler, it is truly a great way to cook economically, as all you need to do for the chicken is boil it to the brim of shreds, either in some chicken stock. Next, boil together. As easy as this dish sounds, it is a true version of what family-oriented meals mean. It began as a mainstay in many homes during the Great Depression. Yet, other experts claim that this kind of eating originated when German immigrants first came to America, with the word dumpling translating to Knödel in German. Creamed corn pudding was a creamy, slightly sweet-baked side dish that offered both comfort and affordability to families on a budget. Made from canned or fresh corn combined with milk, eggs, a bit of sugar, and flour or breadcrumbs to thicken, this pudding was baked until golden and set. The creamy texture and natural sweetness of the corn made it appealing even to picky eaters and was a great way to stretch limited fresh vegetables. This dish was a favorite in old Betty Crocker cookbooks, especially during seasons when fresh corn was not available or when rationing made fresh produce scarce. It could be served alongside roasted meats or enjoyed on its own as a satisfying vegetarian option. The recipe was straightforward and used ingredients commonly found in most kitchens, emphasizing ease and economy without sacrificing flavor. Creamed corn pudding was a testament to mid-century home cooking ingenuity, turning humble pantry staples into a dish that felt indulgent and nourishing. Now, if you look over at rationed shepherd's pie, you can get a real idea of how people were living. Shepherd's pie is normally something you'd describe as hearty, right? I mean, the thing borders on being a bloated fest. It's often something that even gets left over, working as lunch or breakfast the day after. That's just because regularly, it's pretty hard to take down a shepherd's pie yourself. If you talk about the ones made during the entirety of the World War period, then it's an entirely different story. Shepherd's pie wasn't made mostly out of meat anymore. In fact, it used the most minimal amount of meat it could get away with. The rest were just root vegetables like carrots and turnips doing the trick. People wanted to make up for the lost protein by mixing in things like oats and lentils, but that didn't chip away at the real problem. As much of a nifty solution to hunger as it was also a reminder to people of how much their life had changed. It was more of a pipe dream now to wake up to the shepherd's pie you were so accustomed to growing up. Scrapple is one of those meals that makes you pause, but then makes you think. It was born from scraps, as the name suggests, but it came from a place of practicality and care. Pork leftovers, cornmeal, and spices, all the bits you would never see on a dinner plate otherwise, were boiled down, set into a loaf, then sliced and fried to a crispy brown. It was the Pennsylvania Dutch answer to waste not, want not. And it worked. Scrapple fed farmers, factory workers, and children running late for school. It was meat, grain, and heartiness in one bite. Some people loved it. Some people only ate it when they had to. But no one forgot it. It told a story of making do with what you had, of not throwing away anything with potential. And whether you still eat it or not, it deserves a moment of respect, because it fed people when they needed feeding most. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients.
Number 18, sugar water bread. In the poorest black households during the Depression, when even cornmeal ran out, mothers made a bread from flour, water, and a spoonful of sugar. No yeast, no eggs, no milk. Just those three things baked in whatever was available. It was not good. Nobody pretended it was good, but it stopped the child from crying at night because their stomach was empty. In sharecropper camps across the Arkansas Delta, families ate sugar water bread for days at a stretch during the months between planting and harvest when no wages came. A social worker's report in 1935 documented a family of 7 in Coahoma County, Mississippi, living on sugar water bread and black coffee for 11 straight days. The mother told her she prayed every morning that the bread would last until evening. That was the scope of her hope.
Fried cabbage sandwiches were what happened when creativity met an empty pantry. Cabbage was sliced, sautéed in bacon grease or oil, and pressed between two slices of soft white bread. The steam softened the bread, while the crisp edges of cabbage added texture and bite. It was warm, hearty, and just greasy enough to feel indulgent. Lunches like this were quick, cheap, and satisfying. The kind you ate standing at the counter or wrapped in wax paper on your way to work. There was no waste, no pretense, just good flavor born from necessity. The best ones had a pinch of salt and a few drops of hot sauce to bring everything together. That first bite was humble magic. Cabbage, bread, and a little hope, working hand in hand to keep life going. For factory workers, it was fuel. For children, it was comfort disguised as lunch. The smell lingered in the kitchen long after the meal was gone, sharp, smoky, and familiar. Each sandwich told a story of thrift and love, of hands that turned a single head of cabbage into a dozen meals. Fried cabbage sandwiches proved that simplicity could feed both hunger and heart.
Number 14, dirty rice. The name came from the way chopped chicken livers and gizzards speckled the white grains until the whole pot looked dirty. This was thrift cooking at its cleverest. The giblets that came tucked inside every chicken, the parts most kitchens discarded, were finely chopped and browned in a skillet with onion, celery, and bell pepper. That savory mixture got folded into cooked rice along with the pan drippings, staining the grains brown and loading them with deep, meaty flavor. A whole skillet of it cost almost nothing because the most expensive thing in it was the rice. It stretched a few cents of organ meat across a dish big enough to feed everyone, and it tasted far richer than its price. Working families across the South kept it in heavy rotation precisely because it turned scraps into something that ate like real meat, bold, savory, and proof that flavor never needed money. A full pot born from the parts other folks threw away.
27. Harvard beets. Sliced beets simmered in a sauce of sugar, vinegar, cornstarch, and butter until the whole thing turned glossy and deep red. Nobody agrees on why they are called Harvard. One story says the color matched the school's crimson. Another says a restaurant near the campus served them first. The combination of sweet and sour with that earthy beet flavor was something people either craved or could not stand. Your grandmother probably made them from beets she canned herself in August. The jars sat in the cellar all winter and came out for Sunday dinner. You could buy canned Harvard beets at the store through the 1980s, but the shelf space slowly shrank. Most people under 50 have never tasted them. Number 25. Liver and onions. Calves' liver sliced thin, dredged in seasoned flour, and dropped into a hot skillet with a tablespoon of bacon drippings. You seared it fast, maybe 2 minutes aside, until the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed pink enough to bend when you pressed it with a fork. Then you pulled the liver out, dropped a sliced yellow onion into the same fat, and cooked it low and slow until the rings went soft and golden and sweet. The liver went back on top, the lid went on, and you let it sit for another 5 minutes while the onions gave up their juice and the whole skillet turned into something that smelled like a diner at 6 in the morning. Half the country grew up eating this once a week because it was the cheapest cut at the butcher counter, and mothers believed it built strong blood. Children pushed it around the plate. Fathers cleaned theirs in 3 bites. By the 1980s, it had nearly vanished from American tables, not because anyone found a reason to stop eating it, but because the generation that cooked it stopped cooking altogether. Tomato gravy started in the bacon grease left from breakfast. A spoon of flour stirred in until the roux turned pale gold, then a quart of home-canned tomatoes dumped in and mashed down with a fork. The whole thing thickened in the time it took to split the biscuits. It wasn't a sauce. It was a gravy, and there's a difference any mountain cook would insist on, because a sauce is something fancy, and a gravy is what you make when supper has to come from the shelf. Families across Kentucky and West Virginia kept canned tomatoes year-round for this dish, putting up 40 or 50 quarts each August so that winter suppers had something red and hot to pour over bread. The trick was the roux. You couldn't rush it, and the women who made this knew the exact moment the flour changed from raw to ready just by the way the skillet smelled. You poured it over biscuits that were already cold, and the gravy brought them back to life. The last jar of tomatoes in February had a different weight to it, and she always said so. Number 24, Dutch oven pot roast. You needed a cast iron Dutch oven with a flat lid and a 3-pound chuck roast. You seared the meat in the pot over the fire, then tucked potatoes, carrots, onions, and a cup of water around it. You set the lid on top, shoveled coals underneath and on the lid, and walked away for 2 hours. When you came back, the roast fell apart with a fork. The Dutch oven was the heaviest thing in the car, and whoever packed it complained every trip. But nobody complained when supper came out of it. That roast fed 6 people with nothing but time and patience, and the leftovers went into sandwiches the next morning. Potato and onion soup was a warming, economical soup made from pantry basics, perfect for chilly evenings in the 1970s when budgets were tight and comfort was needed most. Combining simple potatoes and onions with water or broth, this soup relied on long simmering to coax out deep flavors without the need for costly ingredients. The potatoes lent body and creaminess to the broth, while the onions added sweetness and aroma. Basic seasonings like salt, pepper, and herbs could be used to keep things interesting without inflating costs. This soup was often served with bread or crackers, turning it into a satisfying and frugal meal that could feed an entire family. Its simplicity made it easy to prepare, requiring minimal time and skill, which was essential in many households juggling tight schedules and tight finances. Potato and onion soup became a beloved staple for those seeking nourishment and warmth without spending much, embodying the heart of 1970s home cooking. Potato rarebit was one of the Depression's clever ways to make potatoes feel more special than they were. The base idea was to take mashed or sliced potatoes and top them with a thin sauce of cheese, milk, and spices. Cheese was often scarce, so the sauce was made with very small amounts stretched as far as possible, sometimes even flavored with mustard to give it more punch. The result was a dish that felt rich and indulgent, even though it used little more than potatoes and scraps of cheese. Families would bake or broil it to give the top a golden crust, making it even more appealing. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, perfect for serving a large family. Children especially loved when potatoes got transformed this way, since it was a rare chance to enjoy something creamy and flavorful. Potato rarebit may not be common today, but it was beloved back then. Number 23, cold plate supper. On the worst nights of July, a lot of mothers gave up on the stove entirely. They laid out a plate with a scoop of cottage cheese, some canned peach halves, a few slices of cold roast beef, a couple of deviled eggs, and maybe a handful of carrot sticks. No cooking, no pots to wash. It looked like a photograph from a 1974 Good Housekeeping spread. You sat down and ate everything cold, and nobody complained because the kitchen was already 90 degrees without the burner running. The whole idea of a composed cold plate as a real supper has disappeared completely. Today, we would call it a charcuterie board and pay $30 for it at a restaurant. Speaking of economics, the following mom-made specialty was homemade pasta sauce. Recently, I was quite shocked to see the huge amounts of jar-filled pasta sauces, as my mom taught me the old-fashioned way to make it with the use of only a few ingredients. For example, the top components to make an awesome-tasting sauce consist mainly of the following: a couple of smushed-up red tomatoes, finely chopped onion, herbs, and spices. Now, bear in mind that I had 2 older brothers, so this sauce was a necessity, as their appetites seemed insatiable. Similarly, pasta sauce is closely associated with Italian cuisine. Although tomatoes were introduced to Italy in the 16th century, it wasn't until the 17th century that tomato-based sauces gained popularity, securing their place in culinary history. With its first mention in a cookbook compiled by a chef, L'Apiccio Moderno, in 1790. Canned salmon loaf was an ingenious recipe born out of necessity and creativity, turning an affordable protein source into a filling and flavorful meal. Using canned salmon as the base, this loaf mixed in eggs, breadcrumbs, and sometimes simple seasonings to stretch the fish into a substantial dish that could serve several hungry mouths. The ingredients were easy to find in most pantries, especially during times when fresh meat and fish were scarce or expensive. Eggs helped to bind the mixture, while breadcrumbs gave the loaf structure and texture. This recipe also made excellent use of leftovers. Sometimes small amounts of cooked vegetables or a splash of cream would be added for extra flavor and moisture. Canned salmon loaf was baked until golden brown on the outside and tender inside, making it a perfect entree to serve with mashed potatoes, steamed greens, or a simple salad. The dish reflected a time when canned goods were prized for their long shelf life and convenience, and when home cooks had to be resourceful to feed their families. Eggless noodles with gravy were another really innovative meal that helped people out during the World War. The rationing efforts made sure eggs didn't escape either. What implications did that have on the common man? Well, you see, it can be a little jarring when you've grown up on nothing but egg noodles. However, this eggless recipe is a lifesaver exactly because of that. See, eggs were too precious of a commodity during the war to use on just one noodle-based meal for the day. Instead, eggless noodles used flour, water, and sometimes just a little bit of oil. That's still a lot more reasonable of an ask from a struggling household than half a dozen eggs or something. Plus, you could make these just at your home, requiring nothing else. You didn't need to use anything store-bought or anything packaged. The versatility wasn't something you could ignore either. Eggless noodles went with just about any makeshift gravy or sauce, and that meant you could spin this flour, water, and oil mixture 1,000 different ways. Depending on what you wanted, you could be revisiting all your favorite noodle recipes. It really helped people out to dabble a little in what they used to eat regularly before things got so rough. Boiled dinner was the kind of meal that did not sound exciting, but somehow meant everything. A big pot, a few chunks of meat, usually corned beef if you were lucky, and whatever vegetables were on hand. Cabbage, carrots, potatoes, sometimes turnips or onions. It was the classic one-pot meal. What made it special was not the ingredients, but what it represented. It was hot, hearty, and able to feed a family of 7 with the same amount of meat that used to serve 3. It stretched what you had. It gave your stove something to do all afternoon. And it gave your family a reason to gather. Boiled dinner filled the kitchen with steam, scent, and stories. It simmered for hours, letting flavors blend and hearts settle. Grandparents swore by it. Young parents learned it fast. This dish was not just about food, it was about tradition, about making something out of little, and about how one pot could hold more than just ingredients. It could hold a family together. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane, where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those.
Number 19, chitterling stew transformed pig intestines into something that divided families. You either loved it or couldn't stand the smell. The chitterlings required hours of cleaning before they could be cooked, a process that tested patience but rewarded dedication. Once cleaned, they were simmered with onions, garlic, vinegar, and hot peppers until tender and flavorful. Some cooks added potatoes or tomatoes to stretch the stew. The aroma was distinctive and powerful, announcing to the entire neighborhood what was cooking. For many families, chitterling stew was holiday food, served at Christmas or New Year's alongside other traditional dishes. Children grew up with strong opinions about this stew, shaped by whether their families embraced or avoided it. The dish represented cultural continuity, a connection to ancestors who wasted nothing.
Cowpea soup was the kind of meal that didn't ask for much but gave plenty back. Field peas, onions, a little salt, and maybe a smoked bone simmered together into something rich and real. The pot stayed on low all afternoon, filling the house with the smell of home. Cowpeas grew easily, surviving droughts and poor soil, much like the people who relied on them. They were full of protein, full of life, a farmer's quiet victory. You'd dip bread or cornbread into the broth, soaking up every drop. The soup stretched across days, tasting better with each reheat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, the kind of food that fed more than hunger. Around every table that served cowpea soup, there was conversation, laughter, and sometimes silence that said, "We made it through another day."
Number 17, fried chicken livers. When a chicken was dressed for Sunday, the livers were never thrown out because they made a supper all their own. These little dark morsels came nearly free, the part most folks today never think to cook. The cook would rinse them, roll them in seasoned flour, and slide them into hot grease where they spit and crackled and crisped up fast. The outside turned crunchy and brown, while the inside stayed soft and rich. A few minutes was all they needed, and a small bowl of them went a long way. Some families served them over rice with a spoon of pan gravy. Others piled them onto a plate with hot sauce and ate them with their fingers straight from the skillet. Cheap, quick, and deeply savory, fried chicken livers turned a handful of giblets into a real meal, a reminder that nothing on the bird ever went to waste.
Number 20, carrot raisin salad. Shredded carrots, a handful of raisins, and a dressing of mayonnaise with a little sugar and lemon juice. You mixed it by hand and served it cold. School cafeterias put it on the tray next to the Salisbury steak, and most kids pushed it aside. But adults ate it because it was sweet, crunchy, and cost almost nothing. The raisins softened overnight and turned into little bursts of sweetness between the carrot shreds. Some cooks added crushed pineapple. Others threw in celery or walnuts. It appeared in every community cookbook printed between 1960 and 1985, usually on the same page as Waldorf salad. Simple, honest, and completely out of fashion. Number 14, smoked sausage and cabbage. A ring of smoked sausage sliced into thick coins, browned cut side down in the skillet until the edges crisped and the fat started to render. Then half a head of green cabbage, cut into wedges, went in with the sausage, along with a sliced onion, a splash of apple cider vinegar, and just enough water to steam everything without drowning it. The lid went on and the whole skillet cooked low for 25 minutes until the cabbage wilted down to half its size and soaked up every drop of smoky dripping from the sausage. German families in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin had eaten this for 100 years before it became a weeknight staple in kitchens that had no German heritage at all. The smell alone carried through the house and into the yard. Cabbage cost almost nothing. A head lasted most of the week in the crisper drawer, and a single ring of smoked sausage from the meat case stretched further than a pound of ground beef because the fat did double duty as seasoning. Families who grew up on this remember the sound it made when the cabbage hit the hot pan, that sharp hiss followed by the smell of vinegar catching the heat. Some added a peeled apple cut into chunks during the last 10 minutes, and the sweetness mixed with the smoke and the sour in a way that nobody could explain but everyone recognized. Others kept it plain, just the sausage and the cabbage and the onion, because that was how their mother made it, and changing the recipe felt like breaking a promise. By the time the skillet came to the table, the cabbage had turned soft and golden at the edges, the sausage coins were sticky with caramelized fat, and the onion had disappeared into the whole thing like it was never there. You ate it with rye bread if you had it, white bread if you did not, and nothing at all if the skillet was good enough on its own. And it usually was. Nobody talked about meal planning in the 1970s. There was no app, no spreadsheet, no calendar on the refrigerator with Monday through Friday color-coded by protein. There was a woman standing in front of an open cabinet at 4:30 in the afternoon, looking at what she had and deciding what it was going to become. She did not need a plan. She needed a skillet and whatever the grocery budget left behind. That kind of cooking does not have a name now because it does not need one. It was not a method. It was survival dressed up as dinner, and it worked every single night. White half-runner beans were not the beans you bought at a grocery store. They were a specific Appalachian heirloom variety, a pole bean with a creamy white hull and a green runner, developed over generations by mountain gardeners in the region, stretching from southwestern Virginia through eastern Tennessee and into western North Carolina. They grew on poles. They had to be strung and broken by hand, and the children old enough to sit still were expected to help. They cooked faster than dried pintos and tasted different, earthier, starchier, with a flavor that people from outside the region found hard to describe and people from inside recognized instantly as home. You put them in a pot with fatback and water, brought them to a boil, and let them go until they were soft enough to mash with your tongue. You didn't time it. You tasted. The seeds were passed between families the way recipes should be. No paperwork, just a jar over the fence in the fall. When families stopped growing gardens, the half-runner slipped away with them. Number 27, grilled Spam on white bread. You popped the key on a can of Hormel Spam, slid the block out, and sliced it into thick pink rectangles. Each slice went flat on the grill grate over the coals and sizzled until the edges curled and turned dark brown. You laid 2 slices on a piece of white bread, maybe added a squirt of yellow mustard, and ate it standing up with one hand. It was salty and crispy and completely satisfying in a way you could not explain to anyone who had not eaten it outside. Spam was the unofficial protein of American campgrounds for decades. It did not need refrigeration, it did not go bad, and it cooked in 3 minutes. Cheese and pineapple skewers were a cheerful, bite-sized appetizer that embodied the playful spirit of 1960s entertaining. Cubes of sharp cheddar cheese alternated with sweet pineapple chunks threaded onto toothpicks or cocktail sticks, creating an attractive and easy-to-eat party snack. The contrasting flavors of salty, savory cheese with juicy tropical pineapple made for a pleasing combination that delighted guests at cocktail parties, potlucks, and family gatherings. These skewers required no cooking and minimal preparation, allowing hosts to quickly assemble a tasty and visually appealing dish. This simple recipe reflected the era's fondness for finger foods that combined convenience with a touch of sophistication. Though the popularity of pineapple in savory dishes has waned, cheese and pineapple skewers remain a nostalgic symbol of mid-century Americana and its inventive yet accessible approach to casual entertaining. Cabbage coleslaw proved that absolutely nothing went to waste in the Depression era. While most people today throw away the tough core of a cabbage, thrifty families of the 1930s shaved it finely to make a crunchy salad. With vinegar, a little sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt, it transformed into something tangy and surprisingly refreshing. Carrots or onions, if available, might be added for color and flavor, but often it was just the cabbage core itself. It became a side dish for meals that otherwise would have been too plain or heavy, adding brightness without any real cost. This slaw was a simple reminder that waste was not an option, and even what many considered garbage could become a dish worth serving. Families learned to enjoy the sharp taste and crunchy bite, and for some, it even became a regular part of the dinner table. Number 30. Pimento cheese sandwiches. You grated a block of sharp cheddar by hand, mixed it with a jar of diced pimentos, a few spoonfuls of mayonnaise, and a shake of cayenne pepper. You spread it thick on soft white bread and ate it cold. No stove, no waiting. In the South, pimento cheese was the summer sandwich that solved everything, and the recipe never left the family that made it. Some added a touch of Worcestershire. Some used cream cheese to smooth it out. A block of cheddar and a small jar of pimentos cost almost nothing, and the whole batch came together in 5 minutes with a box grater and a fork. When store-bought pimento cheese showed up in plastic tubs in the 1980s, The homemade version quietly disappeared from kitchen counters, and the tubs never came close to tasting the same. Pasta is a staple in any home, as it can be prepared quickly and affordably. One great example is fettuccine alfredo. It was always a dish to die for. These budget-friendly recipes included pantry favorites: fettuccine pasta, 2 sticks of butter, cream, seasoning, and garlic. Frankly, it might not be a favorite health-conscious option. While many assume fettuccine alfredo originated in Italy, this is not entirely accurate. Many speculate about this theory that it was recorded to have originated in Rome in the 20th century. However, it was invented by a man, Alfredo di Lelio. It is now a renowned dish known by many versions and has been published hundreds of times in cookbooks since as early as 1933. And viola, a legend, was born. Potato and onion frittata was a budget-friendly egg casserole combining inexpensive ingredients to make a filling and nutritious dish. Eggs were beaten and mixed with diced or grated potatoes and sautéed onions, then baked or cooked slowly on the stovetop until set. The potatoes added heartiness and bulk, while onions provided sweetness and flavor. This dish was easy to prepare and used staple pantry ingredients that were often on hand, making it a popular choice for families trying to maximize limited food supplies. The frittata could be served hot or cold, making it versatile for meals throughout the day. Its simplicity and adaptability meant home cooks could add herbs or leftover cheese if available, but it did not depend on any special or costly ingredients. Potato and onion frittata appeared in many vintage cookbooks as a practical meal solution during difficult economic times, embodying the resourceful and comforting nature of budget cooking. Stuffed cabbage leaves were pretty much the opposite end of the spectrum. They didn't use any kind of meat, which meant that they worked amazingly well as an alternative to meatloaf on the menu. After all, how is anyone supposed to ration anything if everyone's going to start having meatloaf for dinner daily? Plus, the best thing about these was that you could make use of your leftovers to make them. That meant the whole preserve and stretch for as long as possible shtick worked out pretty well. Got some bread or rice that's on the verge of going stale? You can just make it into some stuffed cabbage. Now, cabbage and Americans have never really been the best of friends unless a steak was involved, but this was a different time. Cabbage was cheap, it was easy to grow, even in those backyard gardens that became so popular during the whole period, and it was easy to incorporate. Plus, you could get a complete meal in just a single dish. Stuffed cabbage would have several vegetables and some protein in them too, which made them a great way to get some affordable nutrition. Not something you'd want to miss out on. Now, Johnny cakes were not just food. They were a symbol of survival across generations. These humble cornmeal flatbreads, first made by Native American communities and later adopted by early settlers, carried more than just calories. They carried stories, hardship, and an understanding that nourishment did not always come wrapped in luxury. They were made with water, salt, and cornmeal. The crisped edges, browned just right on cast iron, gave way to a chewy inside that could be eaten plain or topped with syrup, fat, or whatever was available that day. During hard winters or lean harvests, when flour ran low and bread was a distant dream, Johnny cakes were the fallback plan that never fell through. Today, we chase after artisan flatbreads with fancy toppings, but there was a time when this modest corn cake kept entire families going. You might not find it on a restaurant menu now, but it once sat proudly at the center of America's table. Let's start our list off with some potato pancakes, an incredibly famous go-to recipe for grandmas across the nation today. Do you know how and why they ended up nailing the recipe for a fine potato pancake so perfectly, though? Potatoes were one of the most easily available vegetables both when buying with cash or bartering, plus lots of people started growing their own produce. Potatoes were a crop they went for regularly, because the flour and butter needed for a real pancake was not an option for many people. So, potato pancakes became the common breakfast of the century for a good decade or two, and it honestly held its ground pretty well. Made out of grated potatoes and simple seasonings, this felt just as good as a legitimate pancake.
Number 25, hoe cakes and molasses. This was the meal that kept black families alive when there was nothing in the house but cornmeal and a jar of dark syrup. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, fried on a mother's greased skillet until the edges turned golden. Enslaved people in Virginia cooked them on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over an open fire because they had no kitchen, no stove, no pan. After emancipation, the hoe was replaced by cast iron, but the recipe did not change. In the 1930s, sharecropper families in the Mississippi Delta ate hoe cakes with blackstrap molasses 3 times a day because the commissary sold cornmeal and molasses on credit and almost nothing else. A 10-pound sack of cornmeal cost 15 cents and lasted a family of 5 nearly 2 weeks. The molasses gave it sweetness and iron. The cornmeal gave it substance. Together, they gave your family 1 more day. That was the math.
Molasses milk was a quiet miracle in a cup. Warmed on the stove and stirred with a spoonful of blackstrap molasses, it offered sweetness that felt like comfort itself. It was the morning fuel for sharecroppers, mill workers, and children getting ready for long days ahead. The deep, earthy taste filled the body with strength and the spirit with calm. Molasses came from sugarcane, thick and dark, rich in iron and memory. It reminded people of home, of survival, of times when a little sweetness went a long way. Some drank it hot before heading to the fields, others sipped it at night when the chills settled in. There was nothing fancy about it, but that was its beauty, warmth made from patience. Families passed the habit down like a secret handshake of endurance. Molasses milk wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual of hope poured into a chipped cup, a small act of defiance against hunger and fatigue.
Number 24, fried bologna. Long before it became a punchline, this was an honest meal that kept many families going. During the Depression, bologna was often the only meat a household could afford, and it was frequently the only meat on hand. Cooks would slice it thick, cut little slits around the edge so it would not dome up in the pan, and fry it in a hot skillet until the edges curled and browned. That crisp ring around the outside was the whole reward. Pressed between 2 slices of light bread with a smear of mustard, it became a sandwich that a child could carry to school or a worker could fold into a lunch pail. Sometimes it went over rice with a little gravy made from the drippings. Cheap, fast, and filling, it stretched a few cents into a real plate of food, a humble meal that asked for nothing and gave back plenty.
25. Pea salad. Frozen peas, thawed but not cooked, mixed with cubed cheddar cheese, diced onion, and enough mayonnaise to hold it together. Some recipes added chopped hard-boiled eggs or crumbled bacon. You served it cold, straight from the bowl. It sounds strange if you have never had it, but the combination of sweet raw peas and sharp cheddar was oddly satisfying, and it took 5 minutes to make. Church potlucks and family reunions always had at least one version on the table. The recipe passed from woman to woman on index cards and telephone calls, never from cookbooks. Nobody ever asked for it by name, but everybody noticed when it was missing. Number 16. Corned beef hash. A can of corned beef broken apart with a fork, mixed with cold leftover potatoes diced small, chopped onion, salt, and pepper. You pressed the whole mixture flat into a hot skillet greased with butter and let it cook without touching it until the bottom turned into a dark, crunchy crust. Then you flipped it in sections, pressed it flat again, and let the other side crisp. The best versions had a crack of black pepper you could taste in every bite and a crust so firm you could hear it break when a fork went through it. Diners served this with 2 fried eggs on top and a cup of coffee, but at home it was a dinner as often as a breakfast. The can sat in the pantry behind the beans and the soup, and when nothing else sounded good, someone pulled it out and had food on the table in 15 minutes. No one ever called it a recipe. You opened the can, added a potato, and made it work. Hominy is corn soaked in an alkaline solution, wood ash, lye, or slaked lime, until the outer hull loosens and the kernel becomes something entirely different, a process called nixtamalization that the Cherokee and other Native American nations had practiced for centuries before European settlers arrived in the Appalachian Mountains and learned it from them. The alkaline treatment unlocked niacin that dried corn could not release on its own, and the settlers who adopted it kept their families healthier without knowing exactly why. By the 1950s, most Appalachian families got their hominy from a can. Van Camp's was the brand most kitchens stocked, warming it in a skillet with butter and cracked black pepper. Old-timers remembered when it was supper itself, heaped into a bowl, eaten hot enough to steam. The flavor was different from grits, blunter and chewier, and anyone who grew up eating it never confused the two. It was its own thing, and the people who understood that distinction are mostly gone. Number 21. Skillet cornbread. You mixed cornmeal, an egg, a splash of milk, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. Then you dropped a spoonful of bacon grease into a cast iron skillet, swirled it around, and poured in the batter. The skillet went on a grate over low coals with a piece of foil on top to trap the heat. 20 minutes later, you had a round of golden cornbread with a crust so crisp it crackled when you cut it. Cornbread was the side dish that made every campfire meal feel complete. It soaked up the juice from stew, it held together a plate of beans, and it tasted better the second day cold from the cooler. Pineapple meatballs were a popular 1970s dish that combined inexpensive ground meat with canned pineapple to add a sweet and tangy flavor, stretching limited protein further. The pineapple chunks softened the meatballs while infusing them with a unique twist that balanced savory and fruity notes. This recipe allowed families to enjoy a festive, flavorful meal without splurging on fancy ingredients. Typically baked or simmered in a simple sauce, these meatballs were served over rice or noodles, turning modest components into a filling dinner. The canned pineapple was often a pantry staple, prized for its long shelf life and ability to brighten up otherwise plain dishes. Pineapple meatballs became a fun and unexpected crowd pleaser at tables, embodying the spirit of 1970s home cooking where creativity met necessity. Its charm was in making the most of what was available while keeping meals exciting and tasty. Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. Number 25. 7-layer salad supper. You layered iceberg lettuce, frozen peas, chopped celery, sliced hard-boiled eggs, crumbled bacon, shredded cheddar, and a thick blanket of mayonnaise in a clear glass bowl. You covered it with plastic wrap and let it sit in the refrigerator overnight. By morning, the mayonnaise had soaked down through every layer and turned the whole thing into something you could nearly cut with a spoon. Plenty of families served this as the entire meal on a hot Wednesday night, with nothing but a few slices of bread on the side. The glass bowl was half the appeal because you could see every single layer from the outside. It made the whole table look like a party. Many agree that this simple meal can be enjoyed anytime, anywhere. It boils down to one universal thing: sloppy joes. I, however, do acknowledge that this might not be a very refined one. For this mom-made specialty, all you need are the basics, usually in your pantry or freezer, such as ground beef, salt, garlic, onions, and buns. You could opt to throw everything in a slow cooker or take an alternative route that saves time, taking a potato masher and tenderizing the sloppiness. Then you take a bun, toast it nice and warm, and slap on the meat, and there you go, a meal in minutes. The original story behind this meal dates back to Iowa, where a cook dished up loose meat in between bread with some tomato sauce. This then became a quick favorite amongst many Americans up until today. Mock biscuits and gravy was a clever way to enjoy a classic Southern comfort food without the usual cost or effort. These biscuits were made from basic ingredients like flour, baking powder, fat, and milk or water, often skipping eggs to keep costs down. Despite the simplicity, the biscuits came out tender and flaky, perfect for soaking up gravy. The gravy itself was a budget-friendly white sauce made from milk, flour, and fat, flavored with salt and pepper, and sometimes enhanced with bits of cooked vegetables or leftover meat drippings. This version of biscuits and gravy was especially popular in families who wanted to stretch a small amount of ingredients into a filling breakfast or dinner. The gravy was thick and creamy, coating each biscuit and making each bite comforting and satisfying. Mock biscuits and gravy appeared frequently in old Betty Crocker cookbooks as a go-to recipe for economical cooking. It was accessible for cooks of all skill levels and didn't require expensive or exotic ingredients. Vegetable hash was arguably the quintessential war-era recipe. This is because it made use of pretty much everything we've talked about so far. I don't mean just ingredients, but also concepts and ways of life that were unique to the time. Corn, potatoes from victory gardens, leftover vegetables repurposed to make hash. All of that was here. Vegetable hash has, as a result, become a go-to option for many people. Whether it was dealing with surplus food or getting some much-needed nutrition into people's bodies, vegetable hash was your best friend. It involved mixes of diced cooked vegetables, especially those that were included in leftovers. It made it an economic meal, but also a comforting one. What really helped it take off was how adaptable it was. Since it could be made using a variety of different kinds of vegetables, you could really play around here. Different homes would have different vegetables, which would also reflect regional tastes. For example, in predominantly African American communities, it was more likely that you'd see black peas being used. You might be wondering by now, though, with so many dishes that made use of vegetables, what would happen when they'd run out? And the answer might not surprise you, but it's more vegetables. Out of potatoes? Cornmeal mush was more than just a porridge. It was a second chance, reheated and pan-fried. It started simple. Cornmeal, salt, and water simmered into a thick, warm bowl of mush that filled empty stomachs and kept the cold out. But the beauty came the next morning. That same mush, left to set in a loaf pan overnight, could be sliced and fried into golden, crispy squares. Breakfast, lunch, sometimes even dinner, all from the same pot. Poor families especially loved it because it made the most out of the least. It was hot, it was filling, and it was easy to make when ingredients were few and time was even scarcer. You could dress it up with syrup or molasses if you had some, or just eat it plain. Children grew up seeing it on their plate and somehow never got tired of it. Cornmeal mush was humble food, yes, but it was also resourceful, dependable, and quietly brilliant. This kind of food does not make headlines today, but back then, it was the unsung hero of the American breakfast table. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation.
Number 21, ash cakes. Before hoe cakes, there were ash cakes. This was the oldest bread in Black American history. Cornmeal and water shaped into flat rounds and buried directly in the hot ashes of a fireplace. Susan Kelly, born into slavery in Virginia, was interviewed at the age of 100 in the 1930s and described her mother's method of raking the ashes aside, placing the cakes on hot bricks, then covering them with more ashes until they turned brown. You washed them off with water and ate them warm. That was it. After emancipation, Ash cakes survived because many formerly enslaved families had no stove, no oven, and no money. A fireplace and a handful of cornmeal was all you needed. By the 1960s, the recipe had disappeared. The last generation that knew how to make them never thought to write it down. No one did.
Greens and cornmeal dumplings were what happened when necessity met genius. Turnip or mustard greens simmered low and slow until tender, flavored with fatback or ham hock if you were lucky. Into that savory pot went spoonfuls of thick cornmeal dough, heavy, hearty, and filling. The dumplings soaked up the pot liquor, swelling into soft, earthy pockets of comfort. This was the kind of dish that stretched a single pot into a full family meal. It smelled of home, of steam rising from the stove and windows fogged with warmth. Kids might not have liked the greens, but they loved those dumplings floating on top like small golden clouds. Every bite reminded you that simple food could feel rich when it came from hands that worked hard and hearts that cared. Cooking it took patience, but it rewarded you with flavor deep enough to make you forget the struggle. In many Southern homes, this dish was a reminder that even the humblest vegetables could become a feast with a little imagination. It wasn't just survival. It was soul, seasoned slow.
Number 10, hog head cheese. Out of the one part of the pig the big house refused to touch, Black cooks made a cold, savory loaf that fed a family for days. Despite the name, there was no cheese in it at all. After a hog was slaughtered, the head was boiled for hours along with the feet until every scrap of meat loosened from the bone and the fat and gelatin melted into the water. The cook picked the meat clean by hand, chopped it fine, and seasoned it hard with onion, black pepper, sage, and often a good shot of vinegar for the version they called sauce. All of it went back into a loaf pan where the natural gelatin from the feet set the whole thing into a firm, sliceable jelly as it cooled overnight. The next day, it came out of the pan in one solid block, ready to be cut cold and laid on bread or eaten with crackers. Nothing from the head went to waste, not the ears, not the snout, not a bit of it. A frugal masterpiece that turned the humblest scraps into something to slice and savor.
28. Succotash. Lima beans and corn kernels cooked together in butter with a little salt. That was the whole recipe. Some cooks added diced red pepper for color or a splash of cream at the end, but the original was just those two vegetables in a pot. The name comes from a Narragansett word meaning broken corn, and the dish is older than the country itself. By the 1970s, every frozen food aisle carried a bag of succotash, and most families heated it straight from the bag as a weeknight side. It filled the plate, cost next to nothing, and went with everything from pork chops to fried chicken. Today you can barely find it in the freezer section, and most kids have never heard the word. Number 18. Tuna noodle skillet. A can of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, egg noodles, and a handful of frozen peas. You boiled the noodles in the skillet with just enough water to cook them. Stirred in the soup, the tuna, and the peas and let it bubble for 5 minutes. The peas turned bright green, the noodles turned creamy, and the whole thing came together without a single extra dish. Some families crushed potato chips on top for crunch. Others stirred in a slice of American cheese until it melted into orange ribbons through the noodles. This was the dinner you made when the pantry looked empty and you refused to admit it. A can, a box, and a bag of frozen peas fed a family of 4 and left the sink almost clean. Squirrel was free, and in the hills of eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina, free meat meant everything when the alternative was money the family didn't have. A single gray squirrel filled a skillet. 2 or 3 made a proper supper. Brown the pieces in hot lard until the outside crisped. Pull them out, add flour and water, stir until the gravy thickened and turned a deep brown, and what you had was something wild and slightly nutty that no store-bought package ever matched. The squirrel hunting season in Appalachian communities was a social institution. Men and boys went out together in the early morning the way their fathers had, and what came back fed everyone for days. Mark Sohn, the food historian and author of Appalachian Home Cooking, documented squirrel gravy as one of the defining dishes of mountain Kentucky food culture, a dish that required no recipe because the women who made it had been making it their whole lives, as had the women who taught them. The knowledge lived in the hands, not in any written-down place, and when the hands stopped, so did the gravy. Number 26, twist bread on a stick. You mixed flour, baking powder, salt, and a little water in a plastic bag until it formed a stiff dough. Then you pulled off a piece, rolled it into a rope, and wound it around the end of a green stick you had peeled with a pocket knife. You held it over the coals and turned it slowly until the outside was golden and the inside was still a little doughy. That was the best part. Some families dipped the cooked bread in butter. Others tore it open and stuffed it with jam. Kids fought over who got to hold the stick. The recipe required nothing that would spoil and nothing that weighed more than a few ounces in the pack. Cucumber and radish salad with dill was a crisp, refreshing, cold salad that became a favorite in the 1960s for its vibrant flavors and ease of preparation. Thinly sliced cucumbers and radishes were tossed with fresh dill and dressed lightly with vinegar, sugar, and sometimes a touch of sour cream or mayonnaise. This combination created a balance of cool, peppery, and herbal notes that complemented summer meals and barbecues beautifully. Served chilled, this salad was a quick 10-minute recipe that added brightness and texture to the dinner table, providing a healthy vegetable side with minimal fuss. Its simplicity and fresh ingredients reflected the era's growing appreciation for quick, garden-fresh dishes that could be prepared without lengthy cooking. Though less common today, cucumber and radish salad with dill remains a nostalgic and tasty example of mid-century cold vegetable salads designed to refresh and complement heartier foods. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Number 18. Creamed tuna on toast. You made a white sauce in a saucepan from butter, flour, and milk, stirred in a drained can of tuna and a handful of frozen peas, and spooned the whole thing over toast. Some families called it tuna on toast. Some just called it Tuesday. The frozen peas gave it color and something green so nobody had to pretend the meal was balanced. You could have this on the table in 12 minutes on a summer evening using nothing but pantry staples. The dish disappeared so completely that most people under 50 have never heard of it. And that is a real loss, because it was honest food that filled you up and never once tried to be something it was not. Meals aren't limited to just meat. Mouth-watering vegetarian curries are a fantastic option as well. Yes, there are indeed a lot of people who believe this dish to be expensive regarding the high prices of fresh veggies these days. Yet, this can be disproved. Thus, I have found a method that is most definitely budget-wise, with the use of a pack of frozen mixed vegetables. Additionally, there is a misconception that this meal is rather spicy. But if used wisely and sparingly, the addition of the vital curry powders can be indicated to be a true winner. While many believe this dish originated in India, historians have shown that it also has roots in Britain, dating back to the time of British rule in India. Vegetable hash with leftover meat was a practical and delicious way to turn small scraps into a filling meal. This dish combined diced potatoes and a variety of vegetables such as onions, peppers, or carrots, sautéed together with bits of leftover cooked meat like ham, beef, or chicken. The hash was cooked until the potatoes were crispy on the outside and tender on the inside, while the vegetables softened and the meat added savory depth. This recipe was a favorite for families looking to avoid waste and make the most of every ingredient. It appeared in many mid-century cookbooks under various names and was praised for its flexibility. You could use whatever vegetables or meats you had on hand, making it especially useful during lean times. Served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, vegetable hash was simple, affordable, and satisfying. It represented the spirit of resourceful cooking that defined budget meals in American kitchens during the 1900s. Make turnip fries instead, which also happens to be the next one on the list. A lot of people kept high stock. Turnips were some of the most commonly stocked vegetables in homes back then, and lots of people got by on turnip fries. I guess you could kind of call this mock food culture too, or at least something inspired by it. Me, personally, I think it's just people trying to recreate comfort. That's something you'll notice a lot about lifestyles from this period. You hear the words taking notes out of other cultures and innovative and resourceful, and you think maybe people discovered new frontiers for cooking. Really? They were just trying to get as close as they could to the lives they lived just a few years ago. Egg noodles with butter and breadcrumbs were as close to a hug on a plate as you could get. They were the comfort food of those who had very little but still wanted to feel something warm, rich, and just a little indulgent. The noodles were cheap, made from flour and eggs or bought dry in bulk. Butter was rationed, yes, but just a spoonful melted over hot noodles made it feel like a treat. And then came the breadcrumbs. Toasted in the pan until golden, they added crunch, depth, and a kind of flavor that made you forget how little was on the plate. This dish was born in Eastern Europe, but it found a second life in American homes where money was tight and mouths were many. Even on hard days, you could sit down to something simple that felt like more, because sometimes the best meals were the ones that asked for the least. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game. And this was one time where being patient really paid off.
Number 16, pig feet stew. If your grandmother cooked pig feet, you knew them by the smell before you walked through the door. A pig foot cost almost nothing because white America considered it waste, but simmered for 4 hours with onions, vinegar, salt, and red pepper flakes. Those feet released enough collagen to turn the broth into a rich, gelatinous stew that stuck to your ribs and did not let go. In black neighborhoods across Memphis, Atlanta, and New Orleans, pig feet sat in glass jars on the counters of corner stores and barbershops. For families surviving on sharecropper wages, pig feet were one of the few animal proteins you could afford regularly. A woman who grew up in Macon, Georgia in the 1940s remembered her grandmother buying 6 pig feet every Saturday for a quarter and making a stew that lasted until Wednesday. 40 years later, that smell still meant Saturday to her. The feet that were meant to be thrown away became the foundation of your weekly ritual.
Onion gravy and biscuits made mornings feel alive again. The sizzle of onions in a cast iron pan filled the kitchen long before sunrise. Fried in leftover grease and sprinkled with flour, the onions darkened into something rich and aromatic. Water or milk was poured in, and the gravy thickened, bubbling low as the smell drifted through the house. Fresh biscuits baked alongside, soft and golden, ready to soak up every drop. It was breakfast made from scraps, the ends of the flour bag, yesterday's drippings, and the will to start another day right. Workers ate it before heading to the fields or the factory, children before school. Each bite tasted smoky, buttery, and a little sweet from the caramelized onions. No meat, no fancy ingredients, just the alchemy of care turning cheap ingredients into gold. The gravy coated your fingers, your plate, your heart. Onion gravy and biscuits were proof that flavor could rise from hardship, and that no kitchen, no matter how small, was ever truly empty.
Number 6, oxtails. This was the dish that once held an entire Sunday together, simmering on the stove from morning service straight through to the evening meal. The tail of the cow was about as cheap as beef ever got, a bony, gristly cut that the better kitchens passed over without a second look. Black Southern cooks knew that very toughness was the secret. They browned the cut sections hard in a heavy pot, then covered them in water or a little broth with onion, garlic, and a bay leaf, and let the whole thing braise low for 3 or 4 hours. Hour by hour, the connective tissue melted into the liquid, thickening it into a deep, glossy gravy, while the meat grew so tender it pulled away from the bone with a fork. The longer it cooked, the richer it got, which made it the perfect pot to leave going while the family was at church. Spooned over rice with the gravy poured thick on top, it turned the cheapest beef in the store into the centerpiece of the Sunday table. Hearty, deeply savory, and worth waiting all day for.
Number 23, scalloped corn. 2 cans of creamed corn, a can of whole kernel, a cup of sour cream, a box of Jiffy corn muffin mix, and a stick of melted butter. You stirred it together and baked it until the top set and the edges browned. It came out somewhere between a pudding and a casserole, dense and sweet and rich. The Jiffy box was the secret. It gave the dish structure without turning it into cornbread. Families in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky served it alongside fried chicken and green beans, and everyone called it something different. Scalloped corn, corn casserole, corn souffle. The name changed by county, but the Jiffy box was always there. The leftovers reheated better than the first round. Number 15, creamed chicken on toast. Leftover chicken pulled off the bone and chopped into small pieces, stirred into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, all built in the same skillet. You seasoned it with salt, pepper, and a pinch of dried thyme. Let it simmer until the sauce got thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. Then ladled it over slices of toasted white bread. Some families added frozen peas during the last 2 minutes. Others stirred in a spoonful of canned mushrooms. The toast went soft underneath the cream sauce, and you ate it with a knife and fork like an open-faced sandwich that nobody would ever call fancy, but everybody would call satisfying. This was the meal that turned Sunday's leftover roast chicken into Tuesday's dinner without a single complaint from the table. Cushaw was a hillbilly squash that most of the country never heard of. A large, crook-necked, cream and green-striped gourd that grew heavy on the vine in Appalachian gardens from Virginia down through Georgia, one of the few crops robust enough to thrive in Rocky Mountain soil. Its roots went deeper than European settlement. The Cherokee had been cultivating Cushaw for centuries before Scots-Irish settlers arrived, and those settlers learned to grow it from the people who already knew, the same way they learned corn and beans. Sliced thin and laid into a hot skillet with butter and a sprinkle of brown sugar, it cooked fast, the sugar caramelizing at the edges, the flesh going soft and sweet and slightly stringy in a way that butternut or acorn squash never managed. Appalachian food writer Ronnie Lundy, in her James Beard award-winning cookbook Victuals, described Cushaw as tied to mountain memory in a way that nutritional language alone cannot hold. The Foxfire Fund in Mountain City, Georgia, still works to preserve heirloom crops like Cushaw, but the women who knew the exact moment to pull it from the pan are mostly gone. Number 20, Camp Stove Sloppy Joes. You browned ground beef in a skillet, drained the grease into the fire, and poured in a can of manwich sauce. That was the recipe. Stir, simmer, spoon it onto a hamburger bun. The meat was sweet and tangy and fell off the bun onto your lap within 2 bites. Kids loved it because it was messy. Parents loved it because it took 10 minutes and used 1 pan. You could make enough for 8 people with 2 pounds of beef and 2 cans of sauce, and if you ran out of buns, you ate it straight from the skillet with a fork. Every family campout in the 1970s had at least one Sloppy Joe night. Cabbage soup in the 1970s was one of those dishes that managed to be both humble and versatile, making it a staple in many households. It was a light yet filling option, often simmered slowly with onions, carrots, celery, and a gentle seasoning of herbs to bring out its natural sweetness. Some families added diced potatoes or tomatoes for extra body, while others kept it simple for a more delicate flavor. This soup was perfect for stretching a budget, as cabbage was inexpensive and widely available in grocery stores and backyard gardens alike. It also aligned with the decade's growing interest in lighter eating, often being promoted in diet plans and magazine articles promising quick results. But beyond its use in fad diets, cabbage soup was also a comforting weeknight meal, especially when served with warm bread or rolls. Its aroma filled the kitchen with a sense of hominess, and its ease of preparation meant it could be left to simmer while other tasks were done. In a time when convenience and health were becoming equal priorities, cabbage soup struck a balance, offering nourishment without fuss. It was a dish that could be adapted endlessly, yet never lost its straightforward charm. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Number 17. Ground beef stroganoff. The original used tenderloin and sour cream and cost a fortune, but the 1970s home version used a pound of hamburger, a packet of Lipton onion soup mix, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a container of sour cream stirred in at the end. Served over egg noodles, it made people think you had done something special. Betty Crocker published this version in 1969, and it landed in church cookbooks and PTA recipe collections for the next 15 years. It was fast enough to be worth the stovetop heat on a summer night, and it stretched 1 pound of beef across 4 plates. When the 1990s arrived with their obsession with fresh ingredients, this became something people were embarrassed to admit they still made. Recently, I learned about a new term, frugal meals. I thought back to one thing my mom used to make that could be seen in the same light. Well, rather befittingly, she used to make us her homemade pizza with the use of only a few pantry-stored items and fridge favorites. So, with this meal, you will need flour, salt, Italian herbs, tomato sauce, eggs, and water. Later, when the dough is all spread out, just add the toppings, such as sausages with some cheese. Historically speaking, it is believed that many natives from Naples sold similar flatbreads with toppings years before. Nevertheless, the legend goes that a baker by the name of Raffaele Esposito gained credit for this dish after making a pizza for King Umberto I and Queen Margherita in 1889. Rice pudding with raisins was a beloved sweet treat in many American homes, especially when families wanted to make the most of leftover rice. This dessert combined cooked rice with milk, sugar, and often a splash of vanilla or cinnamon for flavor. Raisins added a natural sweetness and a chewy texture that brightened each spoonful. The recipe was simple and affordable, relying on staples that most kitchens already had. Rice pudding was usually baked or simmered slowly until it became creamy and thick, offering comfort after a humble meal. This dish was often served warm, but could also be enjoyed cold, making it a versatile option for different seasons. Because rice was inexpensive and filling, rice pudding was a perfect way to end a meal without wasting leftovers or expensive ingredients. It appeared frequently in Betty Crocker cookbooks and community recipe collections, highlighting its importance in budget-conscious cooking. Families appreciated rice pudding, not only for its taste, but also because it felt like a small indulgence during lean times. It brought sweetness and warmth to the table when resources were scarce, showing how simple ingredients could create something memorable. Powdered egg omelets were a super affordable and practical solution, especially to war-era woes. Powdered eggs were firstly available in bulk, which made them a wonderful alternative. You already know about how hard it was to get a batch of eggs back then. They were also a good source of protein that could be stretched through many meals. For a powdered egg omelet, you pretty much just needed to mix them in with water or milk before cooking. Then you could use margarine or lard. Lard was a lot more common than margarine, especially due to how it could be reused. Some people that could afford it would use vegetable oil for cooking. It also paid to eat healthier because it generally kept your appetite lower. The seasonings were really plain. At least salt and pepper weren't taken away from the people yet. Now, if you really wanted to make a meal out of this, you could make use of some leftover veggies and sauté them. Spam or corned beef would work really well. It was a bit of a treat to include cheese, but some people who were pretty strong fans of it did. Though the general consensus was that you'd save your cheese for better meals and more important days. Rice and milk was not glamorous, but it was dependable in a way that mattered. It was breakfast when cereal ran out. It was dessert when cakes were too much to ask for. It was warmth in a bowl, made from little more than yesterday's rice, a splash of milk, and a spoonful of sugar if you had it. Some added cinnamon, others stirred in raisins or nuts. But the heart of it stayed the same. Soft grains swimming in a creamy mixture that filled your belly and soothed your soul. It was the kind of food that never made the cookbooks, but always made the memories. Every culture had a version of it, and every child who grew up poor knew the taste. Rice and milk was not just a meal. It was a fallback, a safety net, a quiet promise that even when things were uncertain, you would still be fed. Families passed down their own tweaks and touches. A little vanilla here, a little honey there. But at its core, it was survival dressed as simplicity. And for the people who ate it, it was enough. Sometimes that was all that mattered. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread.
Then number 13, bean pie. In 1930, Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam introduced the bean pie as a deliberate act of culinary independence. Navy beans, cooked soft, blended with sugar, butter, eggs, cinnamon, and nutmeg, and baked in a pie crust. It was designed to replace sweet potato pie, which Muhammad considered a relic of the slave diet. By the 1960s, bow-tied men selling bean pies on street corners became one of the most recognizable images in Black urban neighborhoods, from Harlem to Watts. A single pie cost less than $1 to make. The finished product tasted rich, warm, and spiced in a way that surprised anyone who expected something plain. The bean pie was never just dessert, it was an argument. It said that Black people could choose what they ate, not just accept what was handed to them. For your family, choosing your own food was an act of freedom that started in the kitchen. That mattered.
Boiled cabbage and cornmeal cakes turned 2 humble staples into something close to perfect balance. The cabbage, boiled soft with a bit of salt and maybe a bone for flavor, released a scent both sharp and soothing. On the side, cornmeal cakes sizzled in a skillet, crisp at the edges, tender in the middle. Eaten together, they offered everything a body needed: warmth, weight, and comfort. This was weekday cooking for families who had to stretch every penny. Cabbage was cheap, reliable, and plentiful, while cornmeal was the backbone of nearly every poor man's kitchen. The cakes soaked up the pot liquor from the cabbage, blending textures and tastes that lingered. There were no leftovers, just satisfied sighs and clean plates. Sometimes the meal was seasoned with only pepper and patience, yet it still felt whole. It was the kind of dinner that made you grateful for what little you had and proud of how well you could make it work. Boiled cabbage and cornmeal cakes might not turn heads today, but once upon a time they filled every heart and home they touched.
Number 4, fried catfish. Pulled cheap or free from the muddy bottoms of southern rivers, this fish fed many a family that could not afford to buy meat. Catfish were bottom feeders that nobody had to pay for if you owned a line and a riverbank, which made them a poor man's protein across the whole South. The cook cleaned the fish, rolled the pieces in seasoned cornmeal, and slid them into a skillet of hot grease, where the meal coating crisped into a craggy golden crust, while the flesh inside steamed up tender and flaky. Cornmeal was the key, cheap and always on hand, and it fried up crunchier than flour ever could. A squeeze of hot sauce, a piece of cornbread, or a few hush puppies fried in the same grease, and supper was on the table. Friday night fish fries grew up around this dish, the smell of it carrying down the block. Crisp outside, sweet and flaky within, caught for nothing and fried to gold. A river supper that asked only for a line and a hot skillet.
Here are 100 forgotten budget recipes from the 1970s that have disappeared. The grocery list for most of those meals would fit on the back of an envelope. A few cans, a bag of flour, a pound of something on sale, and whatever was growing out back. That was a week of dinners in 1974, and the family never complained once. If one of these recipes brought back a memory of somebody's kitchen, leave it in the comments. Somebody else watching right now remembers the same table. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. We have more of these waiting for you.